the haunting footage security tried to bury. I first heard about the tape at a truck stop off exit 17, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like burnt pennies and the ceiling tiles always look a little damp. A night shift guard sat 2 stools down from me, staring into a chipped mug, talking to nobody in particular. He kept saying the same line over and over, almost like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't real. You don't hear breathing on a silent feed. You just don't. He said it again, louder, then glanced at me like he knew I was listening and wanted me to ask, so I did. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? He told me about Ridgeway Commons, a tired mall just outside a Midwestern town that has more storage units than stoplights. At noon, the place still gets a trickle of shoppers picking through discount racks. After dark, it's a maze of echoing corridors, motionless escalators, and posters for stores that closed long ago. The guard's name was Quinn, and he said there was one hallway on the second level that nobody liked to watch. It ran past a shuttered arcade, past an empty seasonal shop that used to sell calendars and then Halloween masks, and then sat vacant all year. The camera that covered it was labeled C24 on the matrix. Everybody knew C24. Quinn said the first time he saw it was just after 3 in the morning, a Tuesday sliding into Wednesday. He had the control room to himself. Screens stacked from waist to ceiling cast the room in pale gray-blue light. On the metal desk sat a half-eaten donut and a legal pad with the round schedule. The radio was turned down low. The vents hummed with that dry, recycled air that only old buildings breathe. He was checking the feeds in a lazy rhythm when C24 flickered and rolled. Static crawled up from the bottom like heat shimmer. He leaned forward. The hallway was empty. Dust motes drifted. A maintenance door at the far end was chained from the inside. He watched for a full minute, then looked away to note the timestamp. When he looked back, someone was standing under the weak yellow light. No, he told me. Not someone, not exactly. It was as if a body had been assembled out of suggestions, the way a face appears in fog on a bathroom mirror, not there and yet undeniable. It had the length of a person, the outline of limbs, a head tilted as if listening, the posture was wrong, joints too loose, like a figure from a marionette theater with half its strings cut. Bare feet touched the tiles. Arms hung too low. It did not sway. It looked held there by a decision. Quinn reached for the phone. The screen rippled, then sharpened as if focusing. The figure turned its head toward the camera, and the entire feed popped. The room went dark. For 1 second, the monitors threw back his reflection and a ragged shape behind him in the glass. He spun in his chair. The room was empty. The radio hissed once and fell dead. When the power steadied, the other cameras returned. C24 stayed black for a long breath, then snapped back to the hallway. Empty. The maintenance door at the end was still chained. The temperature in the control room felt 10 degrees colder. Quinn told me he listened and heard nothing, but he felt sound, if that makes any sense. The way you feel a big truck pass outside and the floor answers, a low pressure in your chest. He told me he felt breathing. Not his, not the building. Something measured and patient, timed not to be heard. He swore to me he felt it. The guard did what he was supposed to do. He marked the time, rewound the tape, logged the event. He called his supervisor, a broad-shouldered man who'd worked there long enough to know where the cracks were and what to stuff into them. The supervisor came in looking like he hadn't slept. He watched Quinn cue the moment. They sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes inches from the screen. The hallway, the dust, and then, under the weak fluorescent, that shape as it resolved, like frost knitting on a window pane, the supervisor's breath changed. When the head turned and the feed blew out, the man stood so fast his chair toppled. He righted it with shaking hands. "Stop the tape," he said. "Eject it." Quinn laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The man's voice went flat, like someone talking to a ledge. "Eject the tape. Put it in the black case. Don't label it, don't log it, I will take it." Quinn hesitated. He said it was an incident. He said cameras had to be kept. The supervisor leaned close enough for Quinn to smell the coffee on his breath and the metallic bite of fear under it. "This is not an incident. You understand? This is nothing. Put it in the case." So Quinn made a copy on a cheap blank, the kind they bought by the hundred. He slid the original into the unmarked black clamshell that the supervisor brought in from his own locker. He handed the copy to his tote bag like it was nothing more than an old training video. The supervisor took the black case and left by the service corridor. It took him less than 5 minutes to disappear with it. Neither of them signed anything. I didn't believe any of it, not really, until I went there. I wanted to see the hallways for myself. Ridgeway Commons sits low and long next to a 4-lane that runs straight as string through farmland, past warehouses and culverts, and a cut-rate motel with a giant plastic cowboy out front. The mall looks like every other older mall in America. Blank walls, faded logos, a patchwork of roofwork. But when I walked in near closing, I felt that empty space inside it, the way sound seems to get swallowed. The air smelled like concessions and cardboard. The guard at the podium had kind eyes and a sore knee. He pointed me toward the second level. "You're late," he said, like a joke nobody laughs at. "Shops are closing." I passed a nail salon, a cell phone kiosk, a store selling polished stones and tiny fountains. The escalator whined. On the landing, I could see C-24's stretch of corridor beyond a bend. It looked ordinary. That's what shook me. Nothing special at all. Just cheap tiles, a dead arcade with a sun-faded dragon on the gate, a closed seasonal store with a plastic skull leaned crooked in the display. The air was a touch colder. Maybe the vent was blowing there. Maybe that's all it was. I asked to speak with maintenance. A man with oil-stained hands met me under a rumbling air handler in the bowels of the place. He didn't want to give his name. He said late at night things clicked that shouldn't click. He said doors that had been double-checked came up unlatched. "Sometimes you hear it," he said, eyes not quite on me. "Like someone walking just behind you, not close enough to touch you, close enough to make you speed up." He laughed, short and mean at himself. "I don't go past the arcade after midnight," he said. "It's a shortcut, but I don't take it." I looked for janitorial. An older woman was stripping wax from a stretch of floor near the food court with a humming machine that left everything slick and new for a second before footprints found it again. Her name tag said Pike. She told me about the old cinema that used to occupy the wing behind the arcade. They walled it off when leases changed. "There's a service door back there nobody uses," she said, cutting her eyes to the side. "Chained. Management says it's for insurance. But I've seen the chain move. If I look right at it, it's still. If I look away, it looks different when I look back." I asked about the tape. She flinched. She went quiet long enough that the machine's hum felt too loud. "Some things get put away," she said. "You're not from here. You don't understand what people choose to live with." I found Quinn 2 days later at a diner that opened before dawn for truckers heading east. He looked exhausted, and not in the romantic way. He told me he hadn't slept through the night since the tape. He kept waking at 3. 7. The timestamp etched into his brain like a burn. "Sometimes the clock jumps straight to it," he said, rubbing both eyes with one hand. "I'll swear I went to bed at midnight. I'll roll over once. The red numbers are 3, 7. He admitted he still had the copy. He had hidden it behind a ripped piece of insulation above the breaker panel in his rental because he didn't trust a drawer or a safe or a box. He didn't trust anything that looked like it was meant to keep something. He told me he tried to be rid of it once. He drove it to the river and threw it in. He watched it break the surface and vanish. He slept that night and dreamed in black and gray, an empty hallway, a maintenance door at the end, chained from the inside. In the morning, the tape lay on his kitchen table, damp around the edges, no puddle, no trail, just there like it had always been. I asked if I could watch. He said no so fast, it felt like a reflex. He apologized. He said he had shown it once to a friend and had to leave his own apartment because the sound of the breathing, which shouldn't exist on a silent recording, had found places in the walls to hide. He said his friend moved out of state and never told him where. He said he would never play it again. Then he stared at the sugar dispenser for a long time and nodded at me like a decision was happening to him, not by him. "You can watch it," he said, "but not with me. Not in my place. I won't be there when it's on." We used a cheap VCR from a thrift store because he wouldn't use the one in his living room. We set it up in a storage unit he rented behind a self-serve car wash. Concrete floor. One bulb. He handed me the tape in a grocery bag and stepped outside the roll-up door to smoke. I fed the tape. The blue screen snapped to life. The timestamp glowed in the corner. The crawl of the camera system's overlay looked years out of date, green block letters. But this wasn't years ago. It was just a building that hadn't kept up. The hallway appeared, that bland stretch of tile and burn-spotted ceiling panels. I felt silly, then uneasy, then hollowed out by how ordinary it all was. Far away, a cleaning cart squeaked and fell silent. The hum in the bulb above me settled into a steady tone. I told myself I wouldn't blink. At 3, 7, 13, a ripple moved across the floor that wasn't the camera and wasn't the air. It was the kind of movement you notice only because everything else is still. At 3:7:26, the light 3 panels from the maintenance door flickered once. A shape stood in the next frame that hadn't been in the frame before. It wasn't there, then it was. The shape did nothing. It was the careful silence in a room when someone is trying not to be seen. It was a presence fitted around a human outline and not touching. I realized my own breathing had gone shallow. The shape leaned like it was listening or like it was being listened to by something down the hall. I waited for it to turn. Instead, the maintenance door at the end twitched against the chain as if something behind it had exhaled. The chain stilled, then lifted a fraction of an inch as though weight had lessened on the other side. The shape raised its head. I didn't hear the breathing in my ears. I felt it through my wrist bones, where my pulse lives. The sound, if you can call it that, moved with the tape. When the figure turned toward the camera, the feed flashed white, then dropped to black, then came back with the hallway empty. The timestamp had jumped. The tape had not. When the screen steadied, the spot under the light where the figure had stood showed nothing at all, not even dust, as if a piece of the video itself had been erased by a thumb. The humming bulb in the storage unit clicked twice and settled. I reached for the eject button, like maybe what was on the screen had its fingers on the same plastic, pressing back. My own breath didn't sound like my own. I hit stop. The sound in the room went wrong. Not louder, closer. It sat right behind the center of my sternum and pushed in time with nothing I recognized. Sweat pricked in the middle of my back in a perfect triangle I could trace with 2 fingers. The bulb didn't swing, there was no draft, and yet the air moved against my cheek. I told myself to eject, return the tape, say thank you, leave. The VCR clicked and refused to give the cassette. I pressed again. Nothing. On the screen, the blue returned, then the green block text, then a frame from nowhere, not from the hallway, from the camera room. The angle was wrong for any installed camera. The room and the frame had the same desk, the same matrix of monitors. In the reflection on the largest monitor, I saw a figure in a chair and something behind him that looked like a room, forgetting it had corners. The figure in the chair was me. I yanked the cord from the wall, the screen went dark, the VCR swallowed the tape like a trick. Outside at the curb, Quinn flicked a cigarette into a puddle and didn't ask how it went. He looked at my face, then at my hands, then at the back of the storage unit like he could see through metal. "Keep it," he said before I asked. "I can't have it. If it wants to move, it will. Maybe if you take it far enough, it will stop." I didn't want it, but I took it. Because that's what the story demanded, and because a terrible part of me wanted to watch it again, alone, in a place where I could measure the distance between the breathing I felt and the breathing I could hear. I took it to a motel near the highway, 2 doors down from a soda machine with a flickering light. I slid the tape under the mattress and sat looking at the door until my eyes burned. At 3:07, I woke up sitting straight up in the dark with my hands braced like I'd stopped myself from falling. I hadn't moved. The clock changed to 3:08 without a sound. The next day, I called the county, then the township, then the mall's corporate office. Nobody admitted anything. I filed a request for any incident logs or inspection reports related to Ridgeway Commons security systems. A polite person called me back to say those records were not readily available. Another called to say there had been a clerical error. When I pushed, the line went quiet in a way that suggested someone in a windowless room had covered the mouthpiece and was deciding whether to hang up. So I did the lazy thing and asked people who don't get paid to lie. A patrol officer who had answered an alarm there told me there were cold spots in that building that made the hair on his arms stand up under his uniform. A delivery driver who used the service entrance in the back said he always knocked on the rolling metal door before he opened it, and he listened for a knockback, not because anyone was there, but because it felt rude to enter without notice. A barista from the little coffee place near the north entrance said that most mornings before sunrise, before opening, she saw footprints on the tile that came from nowhere and went nowhere, faint and bare, like someone had been standing a long time in one place, then lifted their feet without walking. 3 weeks into this, I went back. The podium guard had a new knee brace and a new habit of not making eye contact. The lights felt brighter, like management had decided to turn the dimmer all the way up in the hope that the brightness itself would push everything bad into the corners. On the second level, the hallway of C24 looked newly waxed. A laminated sign hung on a stanchion in the middle of the corridor. Restricted. Maintenance only. The chain on the maintenance door had been doubled. Fresh paint covered the scuffs around the latch. Even the plastic skull in the seasonal shop had been turned to face the other way. That night, the alarms triggered twice with no cause. Officers arrived, took a quick loop, and left with their lights off. Later, a worker in housekeeping quit on the spot after mopping the second floor and pausing to wring out the strings. In the reflection on the wet floor, she saw someone stand up under the light and lean toward her. She looked up, no one was there. She looked down, shoes in the water pointed at her. She ran and didn't come back for her last paycheck. Management put out a memo asking employees not to discuss rumors. They instituted a no recording policy on overnight shifts. They replaced 3 cameras and left C24 alone, which tells you everything you need to know about courage dressed up as budget constraints. People stopped taking the shortcut and started adding 5 minutes to every round. The arcade gate collected a new layer of fine black dust that looked like soot. I kept the tape in a fireproof bag inside a locked box inside the trunk of my car. I didn't watch it again for a while. I told myself I was being careful, but I was really being delayed. I dreamed in gray hallways and came awake with my heart hammering in a way that didn't feel like fear, not exactly. It felt like I was trying to match something else's rhythm and failing. On a Sunday afternoon, when the sky looked like a bruise, I drove out to a public library 2 towns over with an AV room and a VCR they loaned for old instructional films. I told the man at the desk I was writing about obsolete media. He gave me a key and told me to be careful with the tracking knob. The room smelled like chalk. I closed the door. I set the tape. I told myself I would watch with the sound all the way down, even though there shouldn't be sound at all. The hallway, again, always the hallway, not quite centered, as if the camera wanted to see something it wasn't allowed to. The light flickered once. The timestamp ticked. My breath shortened in anticipation of something I could not name, the way you hold your breath when crossing a short, dark space between buildings. At 3:07, the space changed. It didn't fill. It changed, the way the air changes just before thunder. The figure stood, not arriving, not approaching, but completing a sentence that had been begun before the camera was pointed there. The figure leaned. The chain on the door ticked against metal like a coin nudged by a fingertip on a table. The figure turned toward the lens. The screen flashed. And then, for a fraction of a second before the feed cut to black, there was a frame I hadn't seen in the storage unit. The same hall, same angle, but the far wall was covered in posters for movies that never came out, titles I didn't recognize, actors whose faces were smudges, as if the tape had decided to remember the theater the way someone else remembered it, wrong and stubborn. The frame popped out of existence. The screen went blue. The VCR purred. I took the tape out and realized the room felt crowded, not with people, with attention. like the air had turned its head. My hands shook as I slid the cassette into its sleeve. In the quiet, I heard the softest sound, a long, careful inhale, like someone trying to make as little noise as possible, practically gentle, and then the long control of the exhale. I held my own breath without meaning to. When I finally breathed, my chest hurt under the weight of it. I left it with a friend in another city who has a habit of collecting things that don't want to be owned. He put it in a mudroom cabinet behind a box of light bulbs. He texted me a week later to say his dog wouldn't walk past that door at night. He called me at 3:11 one morning to ask if old videotape could hold a smell. Like an attic after rain, he said. Like metal, but not sharp. More like the taste of a penny when you put it on your tongue. I told him to get rid of it any way he could. He burned the sleeve, then stared into the flames in his backyard until all the ash turned into a single clumped puck. The tape wasn't in the sleeve anymore. It was in his freezer. He did not put it there. Corporate finally did what corporate always does. They announced a plan to revitalize the property, reduce hours, reimagine underutilized spaces. This meant bricking off the wing behind the arcade and knocking down the service corridor to the old cinema. For 3 days, demolition vans circled the property without going in. The fourth day, a crane rolled into the loading bay with a crew that worked faster than made sense. No photos appeared on social media. No one bragged about the payday. In the morning, the chain was gone from the maintenance store. In its place was a welded plate with 8 bolts and 2 coats of paint. Quinn called to tell me he was done. He had put in for reassignment someplace with loading docks and floodlights and actual people after midnight. He said the night before he walked his last round, he paused at the top of the second floor stairs and listened. He heard footsteps that matched his exactly half a flight behind. He stopped. They stopped. He started. They started. He turned to catch whoever was making a joke. No one. He looked down and saw a dark, perfect oval in the dust at the landing where someone had been standing long enough to warm the floor, except it wasn't warm. It was cold. Colder than the air, colder than the railing against his palm. He never went back. And that should be the end. You want it to be. A building grows tired and mean. People write off the dark. A tape gets lost or buried or both. The world moves on. But sometimes the story doesn't care what the world wants. Because copies get made. You know that. If one exists, more exist. That is how the hungry parts of a thing keep coming back. Every few months, someone uploads a low-resolution clip to a forum that specializes in catching what shouldn't have been caught. The clip is always short. The angle is always the same. The figure always turns its head toward the camera, and those who watch insist they hear a breath that the file can't possibly contain. The clip is always removed within hours, sometimes minutes, not by moderators, not by takedowns. It just stops being there. The thumbnail remains like a tooth. You click and find nothing. I saved one. I shouldn't have been able to, but I did. I watched it once on a laptop that I don't use anymore, in a room I don't sleep in anymore. The figure stood where the light is weakest and leaned as if the building itself was whispering into whatever passes for its ear. The turn toward the camera was worse the second time and worse again the third, because by then I knew what part of the frame would resolve first. Not the shoulders, not the head. The space just in front of the lens, as if something had placed its hand against the glass on the inside. I shut the laptop and took a breath and didn't recognize the sound that came out of me. It was too careful, too measured, too patient. I sat for a long time without moving. Long enough that the street outside went from blue to black, and a siren far off moaned itself small. When I opened the laptop again, the file was gone. The folder was empty. The machine's clock said 3:07. I hadn't changed it. I hadn't touched anything. Here is the part I didn't plan to tell. I'm telling it because you asked for every detail, and because when you ask for every detail, you take some responsibility for what you carry away. The last time I stood in Ridgeway Commons, I waited until the gates closed and the old keypad clicked to arm the system. I waited until the night noise settled into its low, hollow hush. I walked up the silent escalator and stood at the mouth of the hallway covered by C-24. The wax on the tiles had been buffed to a shine. The air felt stiller than air should feel. I called out, not words, just sound. The way you might speak to a stray animal to let it know you are there without scaring it. I didn't hear an answer. I felt one. I felt a tension gather the way frost gathers along the bottom of a window. I took one step forward. The light 2 panels down blinked as if a tired filament had to decide whether to continue. The maintenance door, now a blank of welded plate, answered with a tiny tick like metal settling. My chest tightened. Not pain, weight. I thought, don't turn your head. If you turn your head, you'll give it a reason. I did not turn. I looked straight into the dim and talked in a voice that sounded steady outside my mouth and ridiculous in my own ears. You're noticed, I said. That's all this is. That's all this footage ever was. People noticing you. You don't have to come closer. The pressure in the room changed. A draft that didn't exist moved past my left ear. I could have sworn I heard a breath leave that did not belong to me. I walked backward until my shoulders hit the railing. I kept my eyes on the place under the weak light. I took the stairs down without looking away until the bend hid the corridor. Only then did I blink. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath long enough to make stars pop at the edges of my vision. I let the air in. It tasted like coin, like dust, like whatever's left in a room right after the person you've been waiting for has stepped away. Security will tell you nothing happened there. Corporate will tell you the camera malfunctioned. Maintenance will shrug and say old buildings complain at night. The tape will not introduce itself to you unless it decides to. I still wake sometimes at 3, 7, and listen hard, and the house listens back. And on the mornings when the mirror fogs and a shape stands just over my shoulder that shouldn't, I wipe the glass in a single hard stroke from top to bottom without looking at my eyes. I don't give it the satisfaction. If you ever find yourself in a mall like Ridgeway Commons, after closing, walking a long, unbroken hallway toward a door that used to lead somewhere and now goes nowhere, and the air in front of you feels just a touch cooler than the air behind you, and the light above you hums like a mouth just before it speaks, keep your pace steady. Don't turn. Don't say a name. Don't pretend the silence is empty. It isn't. It never was. And if by some chance you hear, not with your ears, but with the part of you that knows when someone is on the other side of a closed door with their hand against it, a breath that is waiting for yours to line up with it, do not try to make yours match. Breathe wrong on purpose. Break the rhythm. Walk away as if you are late for something. Because if you keep the beat for too long, if you share that pattern even for a minute, you may find that when you press play on an old tape in a room that smells like dust and rain, the figure under the weak light does not need to turn toward the camera to find you. It will already be standing exactly where you are, at the precise distance your breath carries in the dark, waiting for you to notice that it has learned your timing and you have learned its. This town has a secret that locals don't talk about. There are towns in America that look peaceful from a distance, where porches sag with old rocking chairs and flags fade in the sun, where roads bend around maple trees and creeks spin under steel bridges. You pass through, you buy coffee, you nod at the clerk, and you move on. Then there are places that hold the air a little too still, places where conversations stop the second you step inside, places where people learn to live by a rule that is never written down. Do not speak about it. Do not ever speak about it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I found one of those places on a gray afternoon in late October. A road sign with peeling paint pointed left toward a town called Dunsmuir. The letters were cracked and flaking, like they had been trying to slide off the wood for years. The road narrowed and tunneled under trees. A river ran beside it, dark and quick, and an old steel bridge took me over with a hollow clang. Past the bridge, the town appeared, set low in a pocket of hills. There was a diner with a roof that once had been red, a gas station with a gleaming new pump that looked strange beside the rusted canopy, a church at the edge of town, pale and sunburnt, its doors wrapped in chain. It was 4 in the afternoon when I pushed into the diner. The bell over the door clinked and kept swinging for longer than felt normal. The place smelled like coffee and fryer oil and lemon cleaner. The booths were covered in vinyl that had split in quiet little lightning bolts. A woman behind the counter looked up, nodded, and poured coffee without a word. She had a soft face and heavy eyes. A clock above her said 4:18. The second hand twitched and hesitated as if it needed permission to keep going. I asked how far it was to the next town. The woman said, "You can get there if you keep the river on your right." I asked if there was a motel nearby. She said there is one by the feed store. I asked about the church with the chains on the door. She looked at the clock. She wiped a clean spot on the counter that did not need wiping. Then she said, "The door is not for you." She smiled, a tiny smile that had no warmth, and poured more coffee I did not ask for. The bell over the door clinked again, and I realized I was the only person in the room. At 5:30, the sky turned early dark, the way it does in hill towns where the sun slides behind the ridge and leaves the streets in blue shadow. I checked into the motel by the feed store. The clerk slid a key across the counter and kept his hand on it for a moment. He spoke without looking up. "Curtains closed by 10, lights off by 11, no music after midnight. If you hear the bell at 3, stay inside." He did not explain what bell. He did not ask for a signature. When I asked about a receipt, he tore a piece of paper from a pad and wrote a number with a slow, careful hand. The pen scratched loud in the quiet room. The room smelled like dust and laundry soap. The blanket was heavy, the kind of weight that feels like a hand. There was a card on the nightstand that listed the rules again. Curtains closed, no whistling after dark. If the television turns on by itself, do not look at the screen. It was printed with a smudged stamp that had bled red into the paper. I slid the card under the lamp and tried not to think about it. Dunsmuir carried an odd rhythm. Streets got noisy and then fell silent, not in a way that matched traffic or business hours, but like the town breathed out and then held its breath. People moved with purpose near sunset, carrying boxes to porches and hanging wind chimes that never moved. I passed the general store and saw a shelf of chalk and twine beside a display of canned peaches. I saw jars of salt stacked higher than coffee. An old man pulled a crate toward the door and stopped when he saw me. He had that same tired look, like sleep had become only a habit. He nodded once. Then he said, "Late day is not a good time for walking. Keep to the motel after dark." His voice was low and even. He did not sound afraid. He sounded practiced. Near 6:30, I heard the first sound of the bell. It was not a bright church bell. It was a low iron sound that rolled across the street and into my chest, the way thunder travels under a floor. It rang once and stopped. A few seconds passed, then it rang again. I counted 7 slow strikes. The sound came from the direction of the church that wore chains like a necklace. The bell rang, and every porch light in town flickered at the same time. Not off, not on. A shiver in the filament, a warning tapped on glass. The church sat beyond a narrow field, set aside from the last corner of houses. Its shingles were curled and black. The cross on the roof leaned like it was tired. The doors were chained with a padlock the size of a hand. The vestibule window had been painted over, but I could see the shape of pews inside, gray rows like ribs. Someone had slid a length of metal through the chain as if to add weight. Behind the building, a line of trees stood like a wall. It looked like a place that had been locked out of its own purpose. I asked about the church at the general store the next morning. The clerk said it had been closed after something happened that people did not agree on. Some said a fire, some said a collapse, some said nothing at all. He asked if I had slept well. I said well enough. He handed me a paper sack with a jar of coffee and a roll of twine inside. I told him I had not asked for these. He said, better to have them. Dunsmuir had its stories, and they traveled like moths that lived in a coat. You shook the sleeve, and one would drift out and flutter near your ear. A driver had left a car running on the bridge with the door open. A pair of hikers had gone into the woods and had returned walking 20 paces apart, each staring straight ahead, each refusing to say a word. A trooper had come to answer a call and never arrived at the address. The trooper's car had been found on the bridge, with the radio still crackling, and a hat had rested on the trunk with a dark ring of water around it, like the hat had been placed on ice. The records, so people said, named the call as a noise complaint. The record did not name the caller. There was a sign in the motel office that said, "Quiet hours after 11." Another sign sat behind the first sign, half turned away. "No mirrors uncovered after midnight." I asked the clerk what that meant. He said some things like to be looked at, some things like to be seen, do not give them what they want. He slid the sign flat on the counter and then slid it back again like it burned. I met a traveler at the gas station just before noon. He wore a jacket too light for October. He had the charged look of someone who had not slept. He said he was a photographer. He said he had set up a tripod across from the chain church the night before. He had waited until 3 in the morning when the bell was supposed to toll, and he had clicked a long exposure. He developed the file in his camera and saw the pews filled with shapes that were not there to the eye. He described shoulders and heads and a black edge like a coat collar around each one. In the last frame, the doorway had held a figure that faced the lens and stood much closer than the lens had been. He had left the camera standing in the grass. He was buying gas with cash and leaving. He would drive until the sun was gone and then keep driving. In the early afternoon, I walked the street that ran behind the diner. It led to Willow Creek Road, where the houses were set back and old. Some windows were nailed over with boards so sun-bleached that they looked like bone. In one yard, a swing hung without a seat. In another yard, I saw a stack of stones and a careful little tower. The air changed on that road. It felt still at first, then it felt full, as if it had a texture that pressed against the skin. I heard a sound like a bell far away, and then I realized it was water moving through culverts, making a hollow metallic tone where it hit the rust. I kept walking until I reached a house that leaned hard to one side. The front steps had sunk, so the door looked surprised. When I pushed the door with my foot, it opened an inch and then stuck against something soft on the other side. A blanket had fallen there, heavy with dust. Inside the room, the walls were covered with old wallpaper, roses. The roses had faded into yellow ghosts that climbed halfway to the ceiling and stopped. On the table in the kitchen sat plates arranged for dinner. There were spoons by each plate and a jar of something dark that had dried into a ring. There was a chair tilted back, as if someone had stood up fast and never sat down again. A floorboard groaned somewhere in the back of the house. My skin tightened. I told myself that it was the heat or the settling of wood. I told myself I had fed the house a draft with the open door. I told myself many things that would allow my feet to move again. I turned and left and walked back toward the road with my hands closed without thinking. When I reached the sunlight, my fingers opened, and I saw that I had been holding little flakes of paint that had stuck to my skin. They were the color of dried roses. In my pocket, I found a loop of twine I did not remember putting there. A woman in the feed store saw me stare at the twine and said that people in Dunsmuir had habits that might appear strange. Keep salt by the door, lay twine in loops on the sill, hang a wind chime without a clapper, leave a coin on the top step. She said these were not for good luck. She said these were for balance. Then she stopped speaking, like someone had pulled a curtain. By late afternoon, fog rose from the creek and stayed stitched to the lowest streets. It did not move the way fog normally moves. It held its line along the curb like a dog. When a truck rolled through it, the fog opened like a mouth and then closed again. People went indoors without rushing and shut their curtains with slow, careful movements. The streetlights snapped on. All of them glowed the same warm color, except one beside Willow Creek Road that gave a colder light that made every leaf look wet. A dog stood under that light and did not cross the line into the street. It lifted its paw and then set it down again on the same square of sidewalk and then looked up like it was listening to something that spoke from inside the bulb. At 7, a group of men gathered near the bridge. Each held a paper bag and a lantern with a chimney so clean that the glass almost vanished. They walked down to the water and set the bags on the bank. The bags lay there like offerings for a river that did not want them. One man cut his bag open and poured salt into the current. Another man tied a loop of twine around a small flat rock and dropped it in. The lanterns brightened and then dimmed so muscle-soft that the light seemed to sigh. No one spoke. The men left in a line spaced evenly, as if they were clock hands leaving marks on air. That night, the motel felt crowded with things that were not in the register. Footsteps stopped outside my door and then moved on. A television clicked on in the room next to mine, even though no car was parked in front of that door. I watched the strip of light under the threshold until it thinned. At 2:57, the bell started. It took a breath and then pushed iron into the night. My chest shook with each tone. The room seemed to lean toward the sound. I counted 1, 2, 3. I stood up without wanting to. 4, 5, 6, 7. I opened the curtain a finger and looked toward the church. The field between the motel and the church held a low, moving shape like water. The chain across the doors had gone slack and lay on the steps like a snake resting in the cool. The bell finished its 7th tone, and then the night held its breath. I closed the curtain and put both hands on the fabric because that felt like a thing I could control. The television in the next room clicked off. Something walked down the hallway, and the light under my door dimmed as if a shadow had bent over it. Morning felt false. The sun came up and burned the fog off the tight streets. The field near the church held circles of flattened grass, each as big as a door. At the diner, everyone looked fresher, and no one mentioned the night. Plates clinked, coffee steamed, the bell over the door clinked at the right times, the clock ticked without stalling. The waitress said that the weather would turn colder by dusk. She said I should take a scarf if I planned to walk to the overlook. Then she slid a folded paper across the counter. On the paper was a hand-drawn map. Do not go past the second switchback. Do not leave the path when you hear water on your left. If you smell iron, turn around. The overlook sat above the river. You could see the way the town folded into itself. Roofs pressed shoulder to shoulder, alleys cut sharp between buildings like seams. The church roof stood like a pale island among darker shingles. Beyond the last house, the woods thickened into a dark line. There were clearings that looked circular from up high, rings where the ground had been scraped clean. The air carried the sound of a truck downshifting on the highway far away, and that sound felt like a gift from a world that worked by simple rules. A notebook turned up at the general store that afternoon. It had been left in a crate beside a stack of canned soup. The clerk said it had belonged to a reporter who had stayed in town for 3 nights. The notebook held interviews that started clear and then turned more sparse, like the person holding the pen had gotten tired, or the people speaking had stepped a little farther away with each page. In the margin of one page, a sentence had been written in a different hand. Speak about it, and it speaks back. On the last page, there was a line written and overwritten until the paper nearly tore. They keep the doors chained to keep the voices in. The clerk said the notebook did not belong to me. He said I could look for 1 hour. He set a kitchen timer beside it. He did not look at the pages even once. When the timer rang, he closed the notebook with both palms and slid it under the counter like a cake coming out of a hot oven. The deputy, who served a nearby district, stopped by the diner before dusk. He had careful eyes and a jaw that held a steady line, the look of someone who had tested courage against landscape and learned to move with it. He sat at the counter and stirred his coffee until the spoon touched the china in a slow, even rhythm. He said the bridge played games with radios. He said chargers failed near the church. He said he could tell you how to get around a truck on a blind curve, but he could not tell you what to do if the bell rang and you were in the open. He paid with a bill worn thin from another pocket and left without finishing his coffee. On my second night, I did the thing I had already promised myself I would not do. I walked to the church after dark. The town had settled into its hush, and the air had that tightness again. The grass in the field held my feet in a soft grip, and the dew reached my ankles. The chain across the doors was taut tonight and silent. I could smell stone. The kind of smell you get from a wet basement when you first open the door. I touched the chain with one finger and felt a faint vibration. It pulsed like the beat of a thing sleeping inside. Around the doorframe, tiny nails had been tapped in at an even distance, the heads marked with chalk. There was a scrap of ribbon hanging from one nail. It had letters printed on it that had faded until only a pattern remained. I stood with my ear near the wood and heard a sound that I have no perfect words for. A voice, yet not one. Breathing, yet not lungs. It was a presence you could hear with your teeth. I stepped back, and the sound stepped back at the same distance. The grass behind me made a hush as something turned in it and then went still. I do not think the people of Dunsmuir hate the church. I think they fear what uses the church as a mouth. They live with it the way a family lives with a sickness that is older than any memory. It does not improve or get worse. It simply holds its ground. You learn the shape of days around it. You find a rhythm that lets you eat and sleep and keep your children inside on the nights that matter. The town had a cemetery on high ground behind the school. The path to it ran beside a stone wall that had seen more hands than any railing. The stones in the cemetery were close together. Many of them were old and unreadable, their faces worn smooth. A few were newer and plain. The newer ones did not list a date of death. They listed a month of birth and then a dash that had been carved and polished and left empty. A dish of white pebbles sat on one of those stones. The pebbles were stacked in a shape like a small tower. At the base of another stone, someone had left a bag of salt tied, shut with twine. From the hill, you could see the whole town, each roof a note on a page. The wind pushed the grass so it laid down and stood up again. The bell did not ring in the day. The bell waited for its hour. I want to tell you exactly what happened on the third night, and I will, but I also want to say that I did not go looking for permission from anyone after it was over. I did not ask the town if I could tell it. No one would have answered. Silence has a way of taking ownership that speech cannot break. So I will set down what I saw and heard, and you can decide what it means for you. I sat in the motel room with the lamp off and the curtains pulled tight. I had placed a line of salt along the door and window ledges in a neat, clean stripe. The television was unplugged. The card with the rules lay face up under the lamp. At 2:50, the air in the room cooled, and my breath came out in a small cloud that faded and returned and faded again. The hallway went quiet, even more quiet than before. 3 minutes crawled by on the clock. Then the first strike of the bell rolled through the walls. 1. The chain of the church slid with weight on wood. 2. A footstep on gravel, soft but different from shoes, the sound you hear when a bare heel presses a stone. 3. A voice outside my door that spoke nothing I understood, not words, but intention. 4. A second voice, speaking the first sentence I had heard spoken by a stranger in this town after dark. Do not answer. The voice sounded like the waitress, or perhaps anyone who had learned that voice is sometimes a rope and sometimes a door. 5. The television clicked on even though it had no power, the screen stayed black, but it had a hum, and patterns moved inside that blackness like fish far below the surface of a lake. I looked at the card and remembered the simple line. If the television turns on by itself, do not look at the screen. I turned my head away and kept my eyes on the zipper of the suitcase on the chair. 6. The space under the door brightened with a light that carried dust in it, dust that moved like breath. The light pressed against the salt in a slow tide and then eased back, like a hand feeling along a locked window. 7. The bell lifted its last tone into the rafters of the night, and the motel creaked like a tree that has survived another strong wind. Silence is not always a lack. Sometimes it fills space and holds shape. After the last tone, the silence felt made, as if it had been built in a shop and fitted into place. The light under the door went away. The hum in the television dimmed and stopped. A single footstep moved away down the hall, then another, each landing at a measured distance, the way a person would walk if they had been asked not to wake a sleeper. I stood very still and waited for the air to warm. It did not. I waited for the urge to open the curtain to pass. It did not. I opened it anyway. The field that afternoon had held circles of flattened grass. Now it held people, or the shape of people, gathered in rows that faced the church. They were not solid. They were arranged like a choir. The chain on the door lay slack again, and the left door hung open to a black the eyes refused to name. The shapes in the field swayed a little and then grew still. I realized that I could not hear crickets. I could not hear anything at all. The quiet felt like a pressure in the ears. Then the shapes lifted their heads, and the air carried the sound of breath, one breath made of many. The breath moved toward the church, and from the dark inside the church came another breath moving out like two oceans pressing against each other at a meeting point. The grass bent in a ripple. My chest tightened as if tied. I slid the curtain closed and stood with my hands on it and whispered that simple plea that anyone might whisper anywhere when the night raises a hand. Please be over. Please let the morning come. Dawn finally came, soft and ordinary. The motel parking lot held wet marks where feet had stood, but they were not footprints. They were circles, each the size of a plate, each a little darker than the concrete around it. The chain on the church hung in a clean line again, and the lock looked dry and new. The diner had fresh pastries on the counter and a smell like nutmeg in the air. The waitress poured coffee and asked if I would be leaving that day. Her voice sounded relieved and tired at the same time. I told her I wanted to understand. She looked at the clock and then back at me. She said that once there had been a mill in the hollow near the church, the creek had shifted and flooded it, and the water stood for a season in dark rooms. Men went in to pull out the machinery. A bell that had hung in the mill and had not been used in years fell and cracked, and the piece that broke off rang once on stone and then rolled into water. After that, the nights became heavy. People woke and found handprints on the inside of windows sitting 10 feet from the floor. Children said they heard singing where no one stood. Many tried to leave. Tires turned to rags just past the bridge. The air in the car turned to glass and made the lungs hurt. A woman drove in circles and ended up back at the feed store with tears on her face and mud up to the door handles. The town stayed. They learned the times. They learned the rituals. They told their children how to live with a thing that pressed without ceasing. Then she wiped a cup with a cloth that had not been in her hand a moment before. She said, "Do not ask more. I like you. I do not want to see your car on the bridge with the door open and the radio talking to itself." I left a little after noon. The highway pulled me like a magnet pulls a nail. The bridge sang its hollow metal song and then went quiet. The river moved under the trees. The road climbed out of the hollow, and the sky opened, and the air felt simple again. I passed a truck that shook its load, and a trooper car set back on a gravel lot, watching traffic, and the sight of that car felt like a promise that rules still worked somewhere. At a gas station 2 towns away, I washed my hands twice and still smelled stone. I bought coffee and drank it so hot it shook my throat, and the burn felt like proof that something could be measured by a simple scale again. A week later, a small padded envelope arrived at my home. It had no return address. Inside was a motel key with a plastic tag that bore a number. There was a folded photograph of the motel parking lot in the gray before sunrise. In the foreground, a window glowed. The curtain hung open half a hand. In the glass, you could see a reflection of the lot and the field and the shadow of a person standing with a camera lifted to their face. The camera was mine. The person was me. Behind that reflection, there was a second reflection that did not belong. It was the pallid shape of the church door held a sliver open, and the clean, bright edge of the lock held between 2 fingers, and you could see the curve of nails like tiny moons. On the back of the photo was a single line in ink. "Leave twine on the sill and do not speak of what you know." That line sits on my desk as I tell you this. I run my thumb over it and the ink feels raised like a scar. I want to tell you that I drove back to Dunsmuir and demanded answers. I did not. I want to tell you that I called the deputy and handed over the photo. I did not. What would any law do with a shadow? What would any law say to a bell that rings without a hand? The world has rules that we can see and touch. Then the world has rules that grow like roots, threading under the road and the house and the floor and the bed. You can pretend they are not there. You can build above them. But if a town learns those rules first, and if that town decides the price of survival is silence, then that town will become a place where breakfast is served hot and the coffee is strong and the eyes of the waitress are always a little flat at the edges. Months went by. At night, a few times, I woke to the memory of that iron tone and thought I heard it in the pipes. I kept a coil of twine in the kitchen drawer. I am not a person who believes in charms, yet I tied a loop around the curtain cord and left it there. Once I found a little drift of salt piled near the door when I had not spilled any. I swept it up and then poured fresh salt along the threshold and told myself it was only because winter was coming. There is a rule that travels with this story. It is not mine, it belongs to the town. Do not invite it by speaking to it with the wrong respect. Speak about the town with a pause and a steady breath. Speak about the people with care and with a kind of love, because they are living under a weight that does not lift. If you find yourself on that highway on a gray day in late October, and if you see the old sign with the letters trying to fall away, and if curiosity pulls your hands to the left, think about the chain on the church and the salt on the sills and the bell that does not need a hand to move. Think about the way a quiet rule can hold a place together better than any law. You can keep the river on your right and keep moving. You can tell yourself that the world in front of you is enough. If you ignore that voice and drive down into the hollow, if you drink the coffee and feel the counter vibrate under your fingers when no truck is passing, if you take a room with a blanket that weighs more than it should, then remember the rules you did not ask for. Curtains closed. No music after midnight. If you hear the bell at 3, stay inside. If the television hums without a picture, turn your face away and count to 7 slowly and then wait for the air to warm. If you walk by the church and your finger finds the chain and feels it breathe, take your hand back and hold it against your own chest until your own breath pushes the rhythm away. In the morning, you can leave. The bridge will carry you like a person carries a sleeping child, with a weight that feels heavier than it should and a care that feels older than time. I do not know what sleeps behind that door. I do not know what the town traded or promised. I know only that the people keep their lives by staying quiet and moving with the rhythm of the thing that lives inside their nights. They will smile at you without warmth. They will tell you how to find the next town without looking you in the eye. They will slide a key across a counter and keep their hand on it for a breath. They will slip you a coil of twine and a jar of salt and not say why. They will not talk about it. They will not say its name. They will live with it and let it live with them, and the bell will ring when it wants to ring, and dawn will come, and bread will rise in ovens, and school buses will climb the hill, and wind will scuff the tops of corn, and the river will turn and turn like a key in an old lock. So, if you ever find yourself near a town that holds the air too tight, and if silence greets you at the door before the bell above it clinks, and if you feel a presence slip into the room like a draft that knows your name, remember this. Some places survive by speaking. This place survives by not speaking at all. And if you stay long enough, you may understand the rule deep in your bones. By then, it will be too late to forget it. By then, you will carry it with you like a small, smooth stone in your pocket, always there, always pressing against your hand when you reach for your keys at night. He should have never opened that door. It was late on a Friday night in a quiet town on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. The air felt heavy after a day of rain, and the road that curved past Ashwood Drive shone with a thin black gloss. Porch lights were dim, televisions glowed behind curtains, and a freight train in the distance called out with a low horn that rolled over the roofs like a warning. At the end of the street stood the old boarding house, a brick rectangle with a sagging porch and a doorbell that never worked. Inside that house, a man named Daniel tried to sleep, but sleep had been avoiding him for weeks, and the night had other plans. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Daniel rented a narrow room on the second floor, right above the front door. He worked at a warehouse near the river, sorting shipments that came in long after sunset. He was the quiet type, steady at a job that did not ask questions. He kept a small schedule on his wall, neat and orderly lines with times blocked out for work and meals and the odd call to his sister in Ohio. He did not drink, he did not go out, and he did not believe the stories the tenants traded in the stairwell. The ones about the basement, and the thing that moved in the old crawl space behind the laundry, and the door at the end of the second floor hall that never opened for anyone. At 11:43 p.m., While he was sorting a stack of bills under the glow of his small lamp, the radiator clicked and sighed, the rain ticked at the window, and from the hallway came 3 slow knocks. The sound was hollow and patient. It did not sound like someone calling on a neighbor. It sounded like a rhythm that had started long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone. He waited. The knocks did not repeat, so he told himself it was the pipes, or the wood, or the wind that rattled the downspout. He stood anyway, as if a string had been tied around his ribs and tugged him toward the door. He opened his room and leaned into the hall. The overhead light's hum buzzed through a yellow haze. The carpet was thin and stained near the edges. At the far end, past the framed exit map and the dusty fire extinguisher, stood a door that matched none of the others. It was a touch taller, a touch narrower, as if it had been measured for another house and shoved into place here, a compromise in wood and paint. He knew the stories, that it was a storage closet, that it was a sealed stairwell, that it did not exist, and everyone else was bored or cruel or both. He also knew that when he first moved in, he counted the doors on both sides on his way to the far end, then counted the windows from the street, and the numbers did not agree. The landlady, Ms. Whitcomb, waved him off with a thin smile. "Old houses have tricks," she said. "Old carpenters make mistakes." He wanted to believe that, so he did, right up until 11:43 p.m. When someone, somewhere, knocked 3 times and asked to be heard. He walked toward it. The carpet gave a tired sigh under each step. When he got close, he smelled damp earth, like a garden shovel pulled from a hole. He touched the knob. It was cold, colder than any metal should be in a hallway with steam heat hissing from a register. He told himself not to turn it. He told himself to go back, lock his own door, and wait until morning. Then he heard a whisper that was hardly a sound at all. He stood very still. The air felt thinner. The lights flickered as if they were trying not to look. He told himself that words can be imagined, that one voice can be another voice in disguise. The whisper came again, almost kind, almost a hum, drawn out through teeth that did not belong to a face he could picture. He turned the knob. The latch slid back without resistance. The door opened an inch and stopped with a tired groan. A draft slid through the gap and brushed his face. It felt like the first breath from an old cellar, or the mouth of a tunnel that had not seen daylight in a very long time. He raised his lamp. The light reached into the opening and touched nothing. No wall, no shelves, no stored paint cans or broom. The darkness did not behave like a shadow. It looked like a place where light did not live. He shut the door. He locked it. He pressed his palm to the frame and felt a tremor pass through the wood, like something unseen had placed its hand there as well. He walked back down the hall and did not run. He closed his room, turned his own lock, and leaned back against the door with his eyes closed. His heart stuttered against his ribs. He told himself he did the right thing. He told himself that he had not actually opened it at all. Then he noticed the smell of damp soil in his room, and he noticed that the wind had stopped, but the curtains still moved. At 12:07 a.m., the knocks returned. Not at the end of the hall, right behind his head. 3 slow raps on his own door. He shouted that it was late, that he would call the police, that whomever it was had the wrong room. The knock stopped. A soft scrape moved down the bottom edge of the door, like fingers feeling along for a seam. He stayed awake until 3:11 a.m., with the lamp on and the window cracked. He woke hours later with his cheek on the desk and light pushing around the shade, like a gentle threat. He almost convinced himself it was a dream until he saw the scrap of paper pinned under his mug. The paper looked ripped from a notebook. He had no notebook like it. 3 words had been written with a blunt pencil. "You let me." He lifted the note with 2 fingers and felt grit on the bottom, tiny grains that looked like sand from a riverbank. He set it down and felt the house breathe. He decided to go to work early. He turned and found the door to his room, not where he left it. He had left it on the wall that faced the hall. Now the wood stood 2 feet to the right, the door frame had moved with it, the paint edges were clean. The old screw holes that should have shown where the hinges lived were gone. For a long moment, he thought he had simply misjudged the distance. Then he stepped back and saw a pale rectangle of wallpaper that had been spared by some old dresser, and the rectangle no longer lined up with anything. He said his own name out loud, the way someone falling says a word to hear a human sound, and he left for work without breakfast. For a few days, he did not touch the far door. He did not walk to the end of the hall. He took the stairs in the back and left by the kitchen because the front porch swayed under a weight he could not see. He heard stories from the others. Nora, on the first floor, said something brushed her ankle while she folded laundry, and no one else was in the room. Jonah, in the smallest room under the attic, said his alarm clock rang at 2:13 a.m. Every night, even when he unplugged it, and one night when it rang, he felt something cold pass over his face, as if it was testing how he breathed. Ms. Whitcomb said the water bill had doubled and no one had taken longer showers. They said these things with the nervous humor of people who want to hear themselves deny what they fear. By the end of the week, the knocks came on the front door at odd hours. 3 deliberate raps and then silence. A delivery showed up with no return address, 1 box of nails, and a hammer that looked like it had been in a fire. The porch light went out and could not be coaxed back to life. When the postman came, he asked if they had started digging in the yard. He said he could smell wet clay when he dropped the mail, and someone had left a shovel leaning against the porch rail. No one owned a shovel like that. The blade had been ground so thin, it flashed like a mirror when the sun cleared the clouds. At 9:26 p.m. on a Monday, he came home to find the hallway colder than the outside air. He reached his room and saw that his lamp was on and his window had been raised, though he remembered very clearly lowering it before he left. He went in and froze. On his bed, placed on the folded blanket as carefully as a gift, lay an old brass key. The teeth were sharp, the bow worn smooth by long use. There was a tag tied to it with a bit of frayed cord. The tag had 2 words written by the same blunt pencil. For you? He held the key and felt a pressure in his ears, as if he had driven up a mountain without noticing. He knew, without any logic, that the key would fit the door at the end of the hall. He also knew that the door had not needed a key when he turned it a week ago. He set the key on the desk and told himself he would ignore it. At 10:01 p.m., his light dimmed, not like a line sagging on the grid, but like a hand placed over a mouth. The key slid across the desk with a soft metallic breath and fell into his palm. He went to the hall and walked to the far door before he could give himself a reason not to. He did not want a reason. He wanted the space between the knocks to end. He pressed the key into the lock. The metal welcomed it. He turned his wrist. The tumblers whispered. The door swung inward without sound. The dark inside pulled at the light in the hall. The bulb did not flicker this time. It simply failed, like an eye that refused to look. He held the door with a shaking hand. He raised his lamp and leaned forward. The air smelled like iron and moss. The floor beyond the threshold did not look level. It tilted down and away, not like a staircase, but like a slope, as if the door opened to a place that was beneath the house and also someplace else. He said hello, then winced at the sound of his own voice. The dark answered with a slow rasp. It sounded like breath pulled across brick. He shut the door and locked it with the key and hung the key on a nail above his bed, determined to prove that he was still the one who decided where things belonged. He did not sleep until dawn laid a smudge of gray across the ceiling. He dreamed with his eyes open and saw a field of doors set into the ground like gravestones. In the dream, he walked between them and counted. He could not finish. The field did not end. The next day, he told himself he would leave. He packed a bag with shirts and socks and the metal photo frame of his parents on a motel patio near Lake Eerie. He called his friend Victor, who worked nights as a guard at the warehouse, and asked if he could crash on his couch for a few days. Victor said yes, though he sounded worried by the request, and he told Daniel to arrive after midnight when his shift ended. At 7:15 p.m., Daniel turned his lock, shouldered his bag, and stepped into the hall. He saw fresh footprints on the thin carpet. Bare footprints, long and wet, moving away from his door and toward the far end. There were no return prints. At the far door, the footprints faded and stopped. The handle was wet. There was no water anywhere else. He left by the back stairs. The alley behind the house held 2 trash cans and the ghost of a vegetable garden that had never taken. The sky threatened more rain. He cut across 2 blocks toward the bus stop. As he walked, he passed a storefront with a narrow display of lamps and secondhand dishes, and in the glass he saw the reflection of the back of his head. Behind his reflection, though, behind the glass, in the store that should have been locked and dark, he saw a door with a tall, thin frame. It stood where no door should be. It stood the way a finger points in reprimand. He did not turn to look. He kept walking and kept his eyes on the gutter where rain gathered and slithered. He took the late bus. He tried to read. The lights in the bus hummed and dipped. A man, 2 seats back, muttered that everyone should sit down and be quiet, even though everyone was already sitting and no one was talking. Daniel got off near the river where the warehouse stood like a row of gray teeth. He waited for Victor by the back entrance under a buzzing yellow light. At 12:02 a.m., the side door opened and Victor waved him in with a quiet nod. They walked past cages stacked with boxes and the whine of a forklift that was bored with its job. Victor asked if he was all right. Daniel said the house felt wrong and he needed a few days away. Victor said he could stay as long as he wanted, that his couch had a good view of a boring wall, and sometimes a boring view could heal things that moved too fast. They reached the small security office. Daniel set his bag down and leaned against the metal desk. Then he heard it again. 3 slow knocks, not on the warehouse door, not on a wall. From behind the metal cabinet in the office where no door could hide, Victor heard it too. He narrowed his eyes and walked to the cabinet. The sound came again. 3 knocks that rolled down the metal like water. Victor put a hand on the cabinet and yanked it away from the wall. Behind it was nothing but cinder block, cold gray squares, and mortar like dry bones. Victor swore and shoved the cabinet back. He stood still for a long moment, the way a dog stands when it hears something you cannot. Then the office light blinked and came back, and he looked at Daniel and did not smile. They left together at 2:04 a.m. and walked to the parking lot. The river moved like heavy glass. A fog bank drifted near the pilings. Victor drove while Daniel watched the rearview mirror. Streetlights passed in even intervals. On the 3rd light, Daniel realized that each time the car rolled under the glow, he saw a tall black rectangle standing in the reflection, as if a door had been placed behind the back seat and bent the mirror as it passed. He did not look back. He watched the mirror and kept his hands flat on his thighs. Victor lived in a basement apartment under a dentist office on Maple Street. The walk down the short set of steps felt like a dive. The air smelled like coffee grounds and old magazines. The couch faced a small television and a shelf of paperbacks. Daniel sat and tried to slow his breathing. At 3:11 a.m., the sound came from the hallway outside, the simple and terrible shape of 3 knocks, and Victor went to the door with a baseball bat and flung it open. The hallway was empty. A draft slipped over his shoes and ran past Daniel on the couch as if something had been waiting to be invited. Victor shut the door and slid the chain and stood with his mouth open, then walked to the couch and put the bat down and said they would get a priest or a contractor in the morning, he did not care which. Morning did not help. The day stood gray and slack. Victor called a cousin who knew a handyman, who knew a carpenter, who had a story about a walled-up passage in a row house in Reading. The carpenter came at 1:02 p.m. with a belt of tools and a calm face. He listened while Daniel said what he could. He nodded the way people nod when they decide to accept a thing so they can move toward the part where they fix it. He went to the old boarding house with them. He stood at the end of the 2nd floor hall and looked at the tall, thin door that waited without impatience. He took a small square of mirror from his pocket and held it in the opening when Daniel turned the key and moved the door a few inches. The carpenter watched the mirror with a still face. The mirror did not show darkness. The mirror did not show anything. It did not show the hall behind them. It stayed blank. He closed the mirror and said that sometimes there are doors that are not doors, sometimes there are holes that were not dug, and sometimes a house is built over something that does not agree. He ran his palm down the frame and felt where the wood had been sanded, then scarred, then sanded again. He said there was an old story in towns like this about a set of steps with 11 risers and a 12th riser made of empty space. People would count and be satisfied, then put a foot down and fall where there was no step. He said there were also stories about men who bricked up their sins and slept sound after, until one night the mortar breathed. He set his bag down and took out a pouch of salt and a small mason line and a chalk plum. He had learned the habit from a mason who drank black coffee at dawn and swore that chalk lines remember the world the way it should be. He hung the plum by the frame, the string shook, the weight turned slow circles and would not settle. He asked for a hammer. Daniel brought the burned one from the porch, untouched since the delivery. The carpenter frowned at the black marks on the handle and did not use it. He used his own. He set 3 screws into the frame and 3 into the door and tied them to the line. He ran salt along the threshold until it looked like surf. He told Daniel to leave the door closed, locked, and tied, and to keep a light burning through the night so he could see if the line broke. He said he would return in the morning with a proper plate and a brace. He said to call if the salt moved. He stepped back and looked weary suddenly, like the room had taken a small bite of him, and he left with a quiet nod. At 2:09 a.m., Daniel woke to a soft hiss. He sat up and saw the salt rolling back from the threshold as if an invisible tide was pulling it inward. The string shook. The screws sang, a tiny metal whine like a sound a child could hear when a television is on. He stood and held the key and did not know what to do. The string snapped with 3 sharp tings. The screws turned. The door eased open, not toward him, but toward the dark that hungrily accepted it. He might have turned and run. He did not. He pressed the door closed with both hands and braced his feet and felt something on the other side pushing back with a slow, patient strength. He said, "Please stop." He did not even know to whom he spoke. The pressure eased. He turned the key. He leaned his forehead against the paint and stayed there until light began to creep around the window shade like a spy. He called the carpenter at 7:04 a.m. The call rang and rang. He left a message and waited. He called again, no answer. At noon, he walked to the corner store to buy coffee and bread and found a small crowd gathered by the alley. A police cruiser sat with its lights quiet but its engine running. 2 officers stood near a man on the ground with a sheet over his chest. The sheet was bright white against his boots that stuck out one end. A neighbor said the man had been found at dawn, stretched out near the dumpster, with a look like a person who left a task unfinished. Daniel felt the world narrow. He asked a woman in a scarf if she knew who it was. She said the man had a belt of tools on the curb. A leather pouch lay beside it with salt in the seams. A plumb bob sat under the bumper of a dirty sedan. Daniel said he needed air and he walked until he could not see the alley anymore. He did not return to the boarding house until evening. The door at the end of the hall waited. His own door stood where it should be now, as if the house had grown tired of the joke. He tried to pack again. He put the key in his pocket and told himself he would toss it into the river on the walk to the bus. As he zipped his bag, the room breathed cold. The window lowered by itself an inch and shut with a soft kiss. The lamp dimmed and brightened and dimmed again. He heard the knock. 3 steady raps, not from the hall, not from his door, but from inside his closet. He opened it with a small sound in his throat that could have been a laugh. The closet smelled like cedar and mothballs. An old coat that belonged to a tenant who never came back brushed his arm. The back of the closet did not hold a wall anymore. It held a tall, thin door, the same shape, the same handle. His head swam. He closed the closet and leaned his back against it and said the words he had read on the note. "You let me." He left that night at 10:27 p.m. He did not turn off the lamp. He did not lock his room. He went down the front steps where the porch sagged and turned left. The street looked longer than it ever had. He reached the corner and stopped. A man stood beneath the big sycamore that tilted over the curb. The man wore a coat that hung like a curtain. He faced away. He lifted a hand without moving his shoulder and knocked gently on the air in front of him. 1, 2, 3. The sound traveled to Daniel as if it had been made on wood near his ear. The man lowered his hand and walked across the street without looking left or right. He moved like a sleepwalker. Daniel took a step back. He went the other direction toward the church where the lights were always on for a little while after the hour. He did not pray. He sat in the last pew and watched the red exit sign burn like a coal and listened to the building creak as if it also had a spine and a set of tired ribs. The next morning, a city inspector arrived after a call that came from no one they could later identify. He wore a jacket with a seal and carried a clipboard with forms attached by a rusty clip. He walked through the house and looked at wiring and pipes and the water heater that rattled when it started. He reached the second floor. He paused at the end of the hall. He looked at the tall, narrow door as if reading a note in a language he almost remembered. He tried the handle. It did not turn. He wrote something on his form and left. On the way out, he told Ms. Whitcomb that old houses collect strange corners, and sometimes those corners collect a smell, and sometimes the smell is not a real smell but a memory of one. She nodded and smiled with her lips only. When he had gone, she climbed the stairs with a hammer and nails and a square of plywood. She stood at the door and waited. She did not raise the hammer. She walked back to her office and called a number she kept in a small book. No one answered that number either. The days after that did not break into clear pieces. Time smudged. He slept in fits. He saw the key in places he did not leave it. On his pillow, in the sink, inside his shoe like a small tongue. He took it to the river and threw it hard. It struck the water with a plunk that felt too small for the weight it carried. He watched the ripple widen and then close like a wound. He walked home and found the key sitting on his desk with the cord tied into a neat bow, as if someone with patient fingers had waited years to learn such a simple knot. Victor stopped by at 8:31 p.m. with 2 coffees and a man from his church who read quietly from a small book and asked to walk through the house with them. The man did not announce anything. He did not demand or command. He listened. He stood in the hall at the far door and said the place felt like a mouth pressed shut. He walked to the basement. The basement had a low ceiling and a strip of dirt floor near the far wall, where an old support post sank like a stake. The man crouched and touched the dirt and rose with a look of distant thought. He said he did not think the house was haunted in the simple way people like to say. He thought the house had been built over a path, like a country lane that had once run from one field to another. The lane did not end when the field was plowed. It kept going under what came after. He said some paths want travelers, some doors want to be used. He said someone long ago had opened a door here and did not shut it correctly. He said someone had tried to build a wall where a door did not want to be. He said none of this was about belief. It was about the shape of a wound and the way it will not close if a piece of it is missing. He asked Daniel what he had heard first. A knock, Daniel said. 3 knocks. The man nodded. He said 3 knocks are polite. They are the old way. They mean a traveler is asking permission. He said the worst thing you can do is open the door when the traveler has asked, and you do not know who it is. If you open, you become a host. If you refuse, the traveler goes on. He looked at Daniel with eyes that had watched factory smoke for years and said that sometimes the host does not know he has become one until the first guest is already in the kitchen. That night, Daniel tried to follow orders. He placed the key in a bowl of salt. He drew a line of chalk across the threshold of his room and across the far door. He set a chair under the knob. He sat and waited. At 1:03 a.m., the chair slid quietly aside and settled a foot away, as if a careful hand had pushed it and did not want to scratch the floor. The chalk line broke without footsteps crossing it. The key rose an inch in the bowl and rested again as if nodding. The door in the hall did not move. The closet door inside his room did. He heard a breath, slow and deliberate, in a space that could not hold anyone. The breath did not rush. It took its time. It sounded like a tide that had finally decided which way it meant to go. He left a recording on his phone for whoever might come next. He spoke into the small microphone with his voice pulled tight. He said he was sorry for whatever he had done, even if all he had done was turn the knob of a door in a hallway that should have been boring. He said he did not believe in curses. He said he believed in mistakes. He said he felt like a man who had signed a contract written in invisible ink. He left the phone on the desk with the recording playing on repeat, like a small litany. In the morning, the landlady knocked on his room and called his name. He did not answer. She opened the door and stepped in and felt a chill ripple her skirt. The lamp was on, the bed was unmade. The phone on the desk whispered the last line of his recording over and over in a thin loop. I did not mean to let you in. The closet stood open 2 inches. The far door at the end of the hall stood open a foot. A line of damp soil ran from the far door to the closet and stopped dead at the sill. The bowl of salt sat empty, with a faint ring near its lip, as if something with many small hands had taken its measure. The police came and did what police do. They cataloged, they measured, they took photographs that flattened the room into rectangles and squares. Officer Nolan walked down to the basement and stared at the strip of dirt and came back up and wrote that the ground smelled like a place beside a river after a flood. He stood by the far door and looked into the dark that did not show the hall reflected in his pupils, and he decided to step away. The report said missing person. The report said no sign of forced entry. The report said the tenant had been under stress. The report did not say that Nolan woke that night at 3:11 a.m. in his own home to the sound of 3 polite knocks that came from inside the linen closet, and he lay still until the knocks moved on like a traveling show. Weeks passed without weeks passing at all. A new tenant toured the building and said he liked old wood and cheap rent. He took Daniel's room. He lasted 3 nights. He left a note under the rent box that said sorry and 2 jackknives on the table, as if the color of their handles had been a promise he wanted to keep. A woman who taught at the middle school moved into Nora's old space and smiled at the stairwell like an actress who believes in second chances. She told a colleague that the house hummed like a distant generator even when the power was steady. She told no one that her alarm shifted to 2:13 a.m. and stayed there no matter how she set it. She left during a rain on a Tuesday afternoon with a single backpack and a plant under her arm that shook as if a breeze was in the hall, but there was no breeze in the hall. The landlady started to sleep on a cot in the office downstairs because the phones rang without calls, and she decided she would rather be the first to hear than the last. She opened the ledger and ran a finger down the old page where the house deeds were copied out for no good reason except that someone had liked the look of handwriting. She found an entry about a previous owner who had poured concrete in the crawl space and then broken it up with a sledge when the water would not run right. She found another entry about a boarder who spoke to the wall in the laundry room and said the wall spoke back with a voice, like a voice in a metal pipe. She closed the ledger and told herself stories about plumbing and air and a bad memory that walks in circles. At dawn, she raised the blinds and found a small brass key on the windowsill with a tag that said, "For you." She went very still and did not touch it until noon when she put on a pair of gloves and used 2 fingers to flick it into the trash. She took the trash out to the can and set the lid and walked inside and locked the back door. When she returned to the office, the key sat on the desk with the cord in a new bow that no one had tied. On a night with a clear sky and a slow moon, a group of teenagers dared one another to throw pebbles at the boarding house and run. They stood under the sycamore and whispered the way teenagers do. They were not cruel. They only wanted to feel their hearts rise. They crept along the fence and raised their arms, and at that exact moment, a soft knocking sound came from the fence itself. 3 polite raps that carried the texture of wood, though the fence was iron. They broke and ran. All but one who stood with his mouth open like a fish, because at the end of the second-floor hall, a door was open, and in the dark behind it, a figure stood. The figure looked tall, but also wrong, as if the lines of the body had been drawn with a rule that did not match the human sketch. The figure raised a hand, the knock came again. The boy ran so fast, he left his shoes. A year did not pass, because we will not count years. The house gathered dust in the places no one cleaned. The porch leaned a little more. The door at the end of the second floor hall sometimes stood ajar for no one, and sometimes closed itself with a courtesy that felt like a joke. When a storm rolled up the valley, the house held its breath, and the lights in the kitchen flickered and stilled, and for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator showed its true note, and you could hear the shape of something that had been here longer than wires or motors or rain. Detective Reed, who was older than his haircut and younger than his eyes, stopped by every few months to ask if anyone had heard from the missing tenant. He stood at the foot of the stairs and looked like a man waiting for a train that would never come to this platform. He took notes that he did not keep. He asked the same questions. He did not ask about doors. One day, he sat alone in his sedan outside the house and watched the second floor windows for an hour. At 3:11 p.m., when the street was quiet and a dog barked twice and then thought better of it, he saw a shape slide past the far window and pause. The shape did not move like a shadow made by a person. It moved like the afterimage in your eye when you stare at a light and then look away. He started the engine and drove to the municipal lot and sat with his head in his hands until the sensation passed that a set of steps was missing beneath his feet and he would fall if he tried to stand. There are people who believe they are too practical to be lost. They do not understand that a path that runs under a house has no use for belief. The door at the end of the hall is still there. Most days it is only wood and paint, holding the quiet air of a staircase that does not exist. Some nights it is not only wood. On those nights, the hallway feels longer than it did at noon. The bulb burns with a halo. The carpet nap looks pressed in the shape of feet that stood and waited. When you stand there, if you are foolish enough to stand there, you will feel the air lean toward you. It will feel like the moment a stranger steps too close on a bus. Polite and invasive at the same time. You will hear nothing at first. Then you will hear 3 knocks. Then you will hear a voice that speaks like a man who will not raise his voice because he does not need to. People who live far away will say that doors do not work that way. They will say a story is a way for a house to make sense of its creaks. They will say a man named Daniel had a bad week and made a bad choice and then made another. They will be right and wrong in equal measure. What is true is this: he should have never opened that door. He did anyway. He did a simple thing, and the world made of wood and light and time turned a few quiet degrees. We do not always see the turn. We feel it. We wake at 2:13 a.m. because an old clock in an old place has decided that is the right time for a soft hand to try a knob. We hear 3 knocks that are polite because the old ways are more patient than we are. We tell ourselves to ignore them. We do. We do not. We stand up and walk to the hall and place our fingers on a piece of metal that is colder than it should be, and we turn and we learn that some doors do not open into rooms, they open into unfinished invitations. On certain quiet mornings, the landlady pauses at the mailboxes and believes she hears someone at the end of the hall speaking very softly. She thinks she hears a man apologizing. She thinks she hears him say he did not mean to be a host. She stands very still and swallows, and the sound goes away. She does not tell anyone. She checks the keys on the hook. There is one more key than there should be. She does not touch it. She turns the sign on the front door to no vacancy, even when she has 2 rooms free. She tells herself it is for safety. She tells herself that boarding houses work best when they are a little empty. She tells herself that one day she will take a hammer to that far door and break it into a pile of obedient boards. She tells herself many things. At 11:43 p.m., on nights when the rain moves sideways, she hears 3 slow knocks and looks up from her chair, and for a second, one small second that stretches, she thinks she will answer. If you visit Ashwood Drive and you stand under the sycamore and you look at the second floor window at the end of the hall, you might see nothing but the tired curtains sagging inward as if the house is swallowing. Or you might see a thin line darker than the rest, the seam of a door that is not quite shut. You might hear a knock, even if there is no wood within reach. You will be tempted to knock back. People are tempted by small rituals. Do not do it. Walk away while you can, walk to the corner, and do not look at your reflection in the storefront glass. If you do, you may notice a tall black rectangle standing where no door should be, and you may learn the trick too late. The trick is not that the door follows you. The trick is that once you have opened it, there is no place left where it is not. The house stands and waits. The train still calls with its low horn. The porch light still fails and returns when it wants. People still move in and out with boxes and hope. They tell one another that every town has a story like this. They say the names wrong and get the times mixed up. None of that matters. The rhythm is what matters. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 3 more. The whisper that sounds like breath pulled across brick. The cold metal of a knob at the end of a short walk that can take the rest of your life. The way a man speaks at the edge of a choice and thinks he has time to think. The way a door waits forever and never gets tired. He should have never opened that door. He did. And now, on certain nights, when the air is wet and the street is quiet and the hum of the wires makes your teeth buzz, you can stand very still and you will feel it. The world has a seam in it. Someone is on the other side of that seam with their knuckles raised, and they are polite, and they are patient, and they are calling on anyone who still believes a door is only wood, a discovery so strange, even police refuse to explain. By the time the Friday night lights flickered off at Millfield High, the air had already turned glassy and cold. You could see your breath drift and vanish over the parking lot, slow and ghost-like, as people shuffled toward their cars. It was late October, a little past 10:40 p.m., and somewhere beyond the last row of houses, the black line of the woods rose like a wall. Locals called that stretch Blackwood Pines. Most cut a wide circle around it after dark. A few swore they heard things moving in there when the wind died. Not animals, not people, just movement. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? 2 students made the mistake of taking the trail anyway. They had done it before. A shortcut from the field to the duplexes along Wilson Street. They were laughing at first, jackets zipped to their chins, footsteps crunching through frost and leaves. One kept glancing at his phone, the screen lighting his face. The other was listening for owls. He said the silence felt wrong. No crickets, no distant highway, just their breathing and the whisper of pine needles. They saw the light at 10:52 p.m., according to the first frantic call to 911. It was not a flashlight, not a fire. The glow came from the ground itself, a low blue pulse that made the damp leaves look like glass. It flickered with a slow heartbeat, brightened, dimmed, and brightened again. They moved toward it because that is what people do when their minds are split between curiosity and fear. They step closer. They tell themselves one more step will explain everything. The clearing was not large, elliptical, almost a perfect oval, as if the trees had agreed to lean back. In the middle, the leaves were parted, and the dirt had a sickly sheen. Half buried in the soil sat a circle of metal 5 feet across. Smooth, pitted in places, wet even though the ground around it was dry. It was flush to the earth like a lid over something deeper. The blue glow leaked through hairline seams, as if the thing were breathing under the surface. When the taller student placed his hand a few inches above it, the back of his teeth hummed. They ran. They tripped. One of them dropped his phone and doubled back for it, fingers shaking so hard he kept missing the lock screen. When they finally cleared the tree line, they could see the stadium lights dying to black behind them and a few stragglers still in the lot. The call came in breathless and broken. The dispatcher on duty logged it at 10:58 p.m. and wrote the words, "Possible downed equipment and unknown hazard." She sent a car anyway. Deputy Holden was first on scene at 11:14 p.m. His cruiser idled on the shoulder, hazard lights ticking, as he stepped into the timber with a mag light and an old habit of talking to himself when he felt a shiver he could not explain. He found the trail, he found the crushed leaves, he found the clearing in the metallic circle at its center. He crouched, he did not touch it. The beam of his mag light dimmed and ghosted out. So did his radio for a few seconds, an empty hiss like wind in a bottle. He clicked the mic anyway and said he needed backup, voice low and steady. He said there was some kind of device. He said the ground was vibrating. By 11:32 p.m., there were 3 patrol cars along Wilson Street and another a few hundred yards north where an old logging road cut into the trees. The officers moved slowly, shoulders tight, hands hovering near holsters because something about the air felt charged. They fanned out and circled the clearing. They each saw it. They saw the glow. They heard the hum under their boots, a note not quite sound, not quite pressure. One of them swore he could feel the hum in his throat. A sergeant named Avery decided they would do nothing until the state was notified. He did not want anyone touching the thing. He asked a younger officer to plant a traffic cone at the edge of the clearing, just to mark the entry point. The cone slid a few inches the second it touched the ground and settled crooked. That was when the sergeant said, very calmly, that everyone should step back. They did. At 12:10 a.m., the noise changed. The glow thinned to a paler shade, almost white, then flared. The trees around the oval bled shadows in every direction. Pine needles lifted and lowered as if stirred by wind, but there was no wind. Something in the dirt flexed. The men backed away again, boots cracking sticks, breath frosting in frantic bursts. A dozen birds erupted from the black trees and shot up, spiraling in confusion. Then everything went still. There were other calls that night. A woman in a house 2 blocks from the tree line complained that her ceiling fan began spinning backward at midnight opposite the switch. A man on Parkview Avenue said every photo on his living room wall was tilted in the same direction by morning, as if the house had been nudged. The 911 dispatcher added those to the log because she did not know what else to do. At 1:47 a.m., a convoy of black SUVs rolled into Millfield and slid onto Wilson Street, like they had practiced the turn. Their headlights were low, their plates were meaningless. The men who climbed out wore jackets without patches and carried cases they did not label. They walked into the timber without asking the officers anything beyond where. They set up tower lights. They dragged a blue tarp across the ground, then rolled it back like a tongue. They unloaded a portable generator that coughed, caught, and thumped. The sound masked the smaller hum beneath their boots, but it didn't erase it. People at the windows in the houses across the street watched in their kitchen dark and would later pretend they had fallen asleep. By sunrise, the clearing was a scar. The blue glow was gone. The metallic circle was gone. There was a pit 6 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and filled back up with a different color of soil, as if someone had brought in a fresher kind from a town away. The men with the cases walked out as the light came up and the SUV doors shut in a crisp rhythm like a marching band. The officers, pale and quiet, were told to finish the perimeter and take down the tape by noon. When a local reporter asked if there had been a gas leak or a sinkhole, the sergeant said the investigation was ongoing and the area was safe. He did not look at the reporter while he said it. What happened next is the part people argue about, because it is the part nobody can prove. In the week that followed, whenever the wind died, you could feel something in your chest if you stood at the edge of the clearing. Just a pulse. Not a noise, exactly. A pressure wave in the sternum. Some blamed power lines, others blamed factories 2 towns over. One man swore it vibrated his molars. A retired teacher brought a compass and watched the needle drag itself in a slow circle like it was drunk. A kid with a drone tried to fly straight over the trees, and the drone flipped, steadied, then drifted sideways, fighting something you could not see. The kid said, the camera feed developed a white halo at the exact moment it passed over the clearing. He deleted the clip a day later because the battery started swelling on his desk. A hiker vanished the following Thursday. He was a line cook at the diner on Old County Road, quiet, known for walking a lot after his shift to clear his head. His route took him along a dirt path that paralleled the tree line for a mile, then curved away. He never came home. The search started before sunrise. It ended after midnight. Dogs circled the oval of the clearing and whined. They pawed at the ground and would not cross onto the disturbed soil. The only thing the searchers found was the line cook's knit cap sitting upright on a low stump, as if someone had placed it there for him to come back and get. There were no prints that made sense. The sheriff stopped the search when the fog moved down from the ridge, and the beams of flashlights just made white walls. The next morning, a CCTV camera 2 blocks away showed something strange. At 3:12 a.m., every streetlight on Wilson Street flushed brighter for 1 second, then dropped to a dimmer glow. The tape showed that surge like a breath across the entire frame. That was when people stopped talking to officers at the coffee counter. They spoke to each other instead, over fences, across aisles at the hardware store, in the whispery dark of the church vestibule after evening service. They listed the oddities like tally marks, the fridge magnets that slid toward the left corner of the door, the auto shop's analog clock that ran slow, then fast, then slow, always around the same time of night, student tablets that charged on the bus, but immediately drained when brought to the corner of the field nearest the timber. A man who tried to mow his lawn near the trailhead said the mower's engine stuttered every time the blade pointed toward the pines. He turned in a slow circle and listened to the stutter keep time, click, 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 like a metronome. Nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud, but they all said it quietly, sooner or later. Whatever the men in the SUVs took that night, they didn't take all of it. Something was still there, something under the ground. 2 weeks after the first incident, a local radio host invited callers to share their stories, and the phone board lit up. A nurse described a patient who came in with steady vitals, then the monitor leaped as if a hand had pushed on the chest pad. A teacher said her classroom projector flickered whenever she cued videos after lunch, but not during morning announcements. A mail carrier described standing, frozen, at the exact edge where the trail met the road, feeling like the woods were pressing against the front of his shirt. He put 1 foot forward, and the feeling grew. He put his foot back, and it eased. He did that 4 times, like he was stepping into cold water and back out, and then he turned around and delivered the rest of his route on the opposite side of the street. The police chief held a short press conference that Friday. At 4:00 p.m., 30 minutes before sundown, he read from a printed statement. He said state agencies had surveyed the area and found no environmental hazards. He said rumors were making people frightened, and frightened people misinterpret ordinary things. Someone asked whether there was any truth to the claim that the department had signed non-disclosure agreements. He folded the paper in half and said, "The town is safe." He said it twice. He did not take another question. On Sunday night, a group of neighbors decided to walk to the clearing as a kind of dare. There were 5 of them, all adults, all stone sober. They wore headlamps, thick jackets, and boots. They took a plastic bag in case they found any litter to prove their point when challenged online the next day. They reached the oval at 9:26 p.m. and switched their lamps to the lowest setting. The ground looked ordinary at first. Then their eyes adjusted. In the dirt were arcs, not drawn with a stick, but pressed by something heavy and curved. The arcs intersected and made almond shapes that overlapped like a chain of eyes. When one neighbor leaned to touch a shape, his headlamp fluttered and steadied. He said it felt like the dirt pulsed under his palm, a tiny upward push, then nothing. He swallowed hard and said he was done. They all were. At home that night, one of them found a thin layer of grit on the soles of his boots that glowed faintly when the bedroom was dark and the door was shut. Not bright, just enough to make him pull his foot back as if he had stepped on something, breathing. He scrubbed the boots with dish soap until his hands cramped. The calls to the department did not stop, but the responses changed. Officers said they were reassigned. Others said they were told to pass anything about Blackwood Pines to a different number. The 911 dispatcher who took the first student call transferred to a desk job 2 towns over. She told a cousin she did not like the way the phone sounded after midnight. She said there was a buzz you could hear if you pressed the receiver just right to your ear, as if a deep note lived inside the line and waited for you to listen. A winter storm hit, and the ground froze. For a while, the stories thinned. People said the snow sealed the place up. People said whatever had been under there was sleeping. But when the thaw came, so did the smell. Not rot, not gas. A faint, metallic scent like wet batteries mixed with pine and river rock. It made the skin at the back of the neck tighten. A trail runner gagged the first time he caught it and cut his loop short. A mother walking a stroller stopped, turned around, and went home by a longer route, heartbeat in her throat. One late evening, just before full dark, a state geologist parked along Wilson Street and walked in alone with a handheld meter and a notepad. She was not escorted, she was not announced. She paused at the edge of the oval, adjusted the meter, and stayed very still. A man smoking on his porch watched the pale rectangle of her notepad move as she wrote. When she came out, he asked how it looked. She met his eyes for a second and said the soil was non-compliant with expectation. Then she climbed into her car and drove away without her headlights for the first 30 feet. Months passed. People tried to make the whole thing into a story that could be told in a single sitting. They could not. It sprawled. It ducked when you reached for it. It tangled itself up in small evidence, 1,000 strange details that refused to turn into a single clean answer. A barista used a new grinder after the old one began arcing a flick of blue inside the housing. A school bus driver avoided a stop for a week because the children all got nosebleeds when the bus idled facing the timber. A runner mapped her jog and saw the GPS track deviate 3 feet to the left, then 3 feet to the right, then swing back, an invisible river pushing and pulling her as she kept her pace. She had not felt it. Or maybe she had and called it wind. The diner on Old County Road put out a tip jar with a hand-lettered sign that read for answers. It filled faster than the one for coffee. People laughed at that, then did not laugh. You could sit in the corner booth with the nicked Formica and hear someone at the counter tell the same story they swore they would never repeat. Their voice would drop, and you could see their hands flatten on the surface, palms down, as if they were steadying themselves against something that might tilt the room. When the anniversary rolled around, the town did not mark it. There were no posts from the department, no statements from the chief, no official anything. But the sky over Millfield was clear that night, and the moon sat low like a coin, and just after 11:00 p.m. 3 porch cameras along Wilson Street captured a thin sheet of fog sliding across the road from the woods to the houses without touching the ground. It flowed over the asphalt like oil. It climbed the curb without breaking. It reached the lawns and rolled back, retreating to the trees in one smooth motion. The cameras recorded that and then glitched for exactly 4 seconds each. In those 4 seconds, the timestamp stalled, then snapped ahead. People will tell you that what we found in those woods was a machine. Others will say it was a lid, and the real thing was beneath, and the men with the SUVs just took the lid. A few will tell you not to think of it as a thing at all. They will tell you to think of it as a place that does not belong where it is, a pocket of rules that don't match our rules, pressing up from underneath like a bubble caught under wallpaper. And if you stand in the right spot after midnight, they'll say you can feel the pattern it makes, the pulse that is not a sound, the pressure that is not a hand, the sense that something vast and patient has turned its attention toward you, not with eyes, but with the cold curiosity of a tide measuring a shoreline. Ask the police about it and watch what happens. Watch the way their faces go still, like a windless pond. Watch how their words slow down. They will say it was a utility issue. They will say the area is safe. They will say the rumors are making people nervous, and that nervous people see things. They will not describe the way the ground lifted under their boots that first night, a fraction of an inch, enough to make every muscle lock. They will not tell you how their radios went dead in their hands and how the silence in their ears was loud enough to make them flinch. They will not admit that for one long breath it felt as if the clearing was breathing back, and that something beneath the soil pressed up, testing the weight of the world, and then withdrew. They do not say that part. They look past you and talk about weather and new tires for the cruisers and the fundraiser for the K-9 unit. They change the subject. They ask how your family is. They call you by your first name and remind you to lock your car because there have been break-ins on the west side. But Millfield remembers, houses remember, the trees remember, the oval is still there, pale dirt in a shape the rain can't undo, and if you stand on Wilson Street on a still night and stare into the dark line where the pines begin, you will notice how your breath feels heavier when you exhale, like the air is listening to you. You will notice that your phone degrades to a single bar for no reason at all. You will notice that the hairs on your forearms lift, even under your jacket, even with your fists shoved deep into your pockets. And you will think about the boys who saw the light, the officer who knelt and felt the hum in his teeth, the men who came and took what they could and left what they could not carry. You will think about the cap on the stump and the boots that glowed faintly in a darkened room. You will think about fog that crawled like an animal and lights that surged like a heartbeat, and the small, private way a person's face changes when they admit, just to themselves, that they have met something that will never fit into words. A discovery so strange, even police refuse to explain it. And maybe that is the only honest thing anyone has said about Blackwood Pines. Not that it is dangerous, not that it is safe, only that it is there, under the dirt and the leaves and the thin shell of what we prefer to believe is solid ground. It is there, and it is patient, and it is listening. If you go, do not step into the oval. Do not talk loudly. Do not drop anything you are not willing to leave behind. Go home while the streetlights still feel like a promise, and shut your door and set your phone face down on the table if it starts to buzz. If the house hums back at you in a slow, steady rhythm, do not answer. Stand very still. Wait for it to pass. And when it does, when the air lightens and your breath comes easy again, tell yourself the same thing everyone here tells themselves in kitchens and living rooms and quiet cars at red lights. Tell yourself it is over. Tell yourself it will not come back. Tell yourself that whatever moved under that clearing went back to sleep. Then listen very carefully to the silence that follows. If you hear the smallest tremor under your feet, a whisper you feel more than hear, do not look toward the trees. Look at your hands. Watch how they shake. Count your fingers. Say your name out loud to keep the room steady. Why did they all vanish overnight? The road into Shaw Ridge wound along a narrow river and then climbed through oak and pine until the pavement narrowed to a single faded lane. People in the county used to joke that you did not find Shaw Ridge on purpose. You took a wrong turn after the feed store, or your phone lost signal, or the fog on the river made you miss the better road. Then suddenly there it was, a little town cupped in a bowl of trees, porch lights glowing warm against the blue shape of the hills. It felt like a place that did not mind if the world forgot it. In truth, the world mostly had. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a Monday before dawn, Nolan Pike guided his delivery truck over the bridge and into Main Street. He had been hauling flour and canned goods to the Ridge Diner since he was old enough to shave. He liked the routine, and he liked how the cook always slid him a plate of scrambled eggs even when the kitchen was slammed. That morning, everything looked normal. Porch lights buzzed. A television flickered in a living room above the hardware store. 2 dogs argued across the street and then gave up with sleepy barks. Nolan stacked the boxes by the back door of the diner, took the signed slip from the night manager, and rolled back out while the tree line still held the last of the stars. He waved at a man in a reflective vest by the water plant. The man raised his hand without enthusiasm. Nothing about the quiet felt wrong. By the next sunrise, the town had changed. A state trooper named Lila Benton slowed at the crossroads because her dashboard compass spun for half a mile and then steadied again, a thing it had never done. She came in expecting fog, deer, maybe a fallen limb. She parked near the diner and walked in with her hat tucked under her arm. She called a good morning and waited for the sound of a chair scraping back. The booths sat empty. Plates of breakfast waited on the counter as if everyone had stepped out. Hash browns were cooling on a skillet without a flame. Coffee steamed faintly and made little clouds in the cold air from the open door. A radio behind the register whispered a song that drifted into static and then back again. Lila stood with her hands on the counter and listened. She heard the kitchen fan, the quiet cling of a spoon, the soft tick of the clock above the pie case. She did not hear a single breath that belonged to a human being. She stepped outside with the hairs on her arms standing up. A tricycle lay in the street beside the barber shop, the back wheel still turning. The barber pole spun without light. The laundromat door was open and a washer hummed with a full load of jeans going in circles. The little hardware store had its cash drawer half open with bills still in it. Lila called the county and then she called again. Her voice sounded too loud and then too small. Birds did not sing. The wind came off the ridge and smelled like old coins. By mid-morning, the sheriff from the county seat arrived with deputies and volunteers. They went door to door and then house to house. Every place told the same story. Meals sat half-eaten. A pair of glasses rested on a novel turned face down. A hot iron lay on a towel without burning a mark. A page of a crossword was filled until the last square and then abandoned. A Sunday dress hung on a closet door, but no shoes waited below it. Pets were left on the wrong side of doors and had clawed them in panic and then stopped. A little parakeet watched the searchers from a cage by a window and fluffed its feathers with slow grief. They found no bodies. They found no footprints. They found no sign that a single person had fought anyone or anything. It was as if the whole town had stood up and stepped out into thin air. The command post went into the community hall. The building smelled like lemon oil and old trophies. Folding tables filled with maps, radios, and stacks of forms. The sheriff, a patient woman named Drea Collier, kept a legal pad on the table and wrote down every odd thing, no matter how foolish it sounded. Numbers were important when the ground moved under your feet. At dusk, Drea sent teams into the surrounding hills. The search dogs balked at the tree line and put their bellies to the ground. Their handlers coaxed and pleaded. One dog tried to bite through its leash to get back to the truck. The teams went in. Without the dogs, the forest swallowed them. Radios crackled and hissed. A volunteer named Brooks heard a long, low tone roll through the trees like something far away calling. He tried to radio in. His voice sounded as if he had cupped his hand over his mouth from the other end of the county. At the school, someone had left a message. The chalk dust on the slate told them it had not been written long ago. The words were big and uneven. They read simply, "Do not follow us." There were no prints in the dust on the floor. The windows were shut. The door was locked from the inside. Deputy Lila stood with her hand near the writing. For so long, her arm shook. Something about the letters felt rushed and also careful, the way a person writes when they know time is thin. Reporters came, and then they kept coming. The first ones were local and arrived with notepads and coffee in paper cups. The next wave brought vans with dishes that rose like metal flowers. A journalist out of the city walked the center line of Main Street with a camera operator backing away from him. He tried to make a joke on air and lost his place in the sentence. People watched from living rooms 3 states away and leaned in when he spoke the words every one of them had formed in their heads. How can this be? He looked over the top of the camera, and something made him step back with his hand up. The camera stayed steady and caught nothing but the empty street and the way the light bent near the trees like heat above a road. Federal investigators arrived with instruments that hummed and blinked. They tested the water, they tested the air, they asked for records from the clinic, and studied them for patterns. They found nothing that fit. Not a leak from the plant, not a cult with a bus and a plan, not anything that could carry away a whole town without leaving a mark. They took samples of soil from the edge of the woods. One lab tech wrote in a margin that the iron content was higher than the sample a mile downriver. Another circled a reading from a small handheld meter that liked to jump and stay high and then go back to normal as if embarrassed to be noticed. Nolan came back on Wednesday because he could not stand not to. He parked by the bridge and walked in on foot. The air felt thick. His boots seemed to stick to the asphalt every time he lifted them. He stood in the diner kitchen and looked at the flour he had dropped off 2 days before. The bags were torn open, but they had not been moved. A line of powder ran across the tile and ended at the back door. He remembered the man with the vest at the water plant. The hand half raised, the slow wave. Nolan looked down at his own hand and saw that it was shaking. He reminded himself out loud that he was not a child. His voice sounded like he had put his head in a cardboard box. That night, the sheriff allowed a small team to stay in the diner with recorders and notepads. The team included Lila, a federal tech named Mateo, who had already built a map of the power grid from memory, a volunteer pastor named Ruth, and a park ranger named Blake, who knew every ridge and gully for 20 miles. They propped the front door and sat in a booth with a coffee that none of them drank. At 11, a tone came through the jukebox, though no one had touched it. It was not a song. It was a single note, like a pipe in a cave. The lights dimmed and then brightened. In the window, something moved. It did not have a shape that a person could name. The air outside looked thicker there for one slow breath and then cleared again. At 1 in the morning, they heard footsteps on the street. They all turned at once. The steps did not come closer. They walked and turned and walked again, as if whoever owned them could not decide whether to approach. Lila stood and called hello. The word felt wrong in her mouth, like a prayer spoken backward. The steps stopped. When they resumed, they belonged to more than one person. The team did not open the door. The sound passed the diner and went toward the school. Later, when Lila gathered herself and went outside, she found 3 damp footprints near the curb. They began and ended on dry concrete. 3 days after the first search, a ham radio operator named Elliot Crane drove up with a rig in the bed of his pickup. He was the kind of man who could coax a signal out of a dead battery with a soda can and a length of wire. He set up behind the hardware store because the alley was open to the sky. He swept the dial through a swath of frequencies until he felt the hairs on his knuckles rise as if a storm had moved in. Then he heard it, a carrier that rose and fell like breathing. He spoke into the mic. He gave his call sign and then the name of the town. The carrier did not break. It swelled. A whisper came through as if he had pressed his ear hard to a door. It said one word that the deputies argued about for the rest of the summer. Some heard it as stay, some heard it as away. Elliot went home and took to sleeping on the couch with the radio on a crate at his feet. He swore that the sound followed him out of the valley, as if it had tasted his voice and wanted to see where he lived. The stories from the last day began to surface. A clerk from a gas station 15 miles away remembered a young girl in a red jacket who ran in just before dark and begged to use the phone. She said her brother was home alone and she could not get her mother to answer. She dialed with shaking hands and listened, and then said hello in a voice that did not sound like a question. She hung up and stood in the doorway for a long moment, like a person who has just remembered where they put something important. Then she walked back out and stood on the curb and looked toward the hills. The clerk did not remember seeing a car pull away. He told the deputy that he simply looked again and she was gone, as if the space she had used had never been occupied by anyone. A man who ran the bait shop by the lake said he heard singing late that night, a kind of low choir. He thought it was teenagers and decided to drive over and tell them to cut it out. When he put his hand on the doorknob, he felt 3 soft taps from the other side of the wood. He opened the door anyway. The lot was empty. The singing drifted away toward the dam. He went back inside and found that all the minnows in the tank had turned in a slow circle to face the same corner. In the morning, the minnows were fine again and wanted to eat. He was not. The oldest person in the county, a woman named June Avery, wrote a letter to her niece and dated it with only the day of the week. The post office took a picture for a human interest story after she turned 100 followers. June had known the ridge since wagons still used the river stones to cross when the water was low. Her letter said this: "We have had a hum in the valley for as long as we have had a road. People used to talk about it when the weather went still. They called it a gate as a way to put a word on a thing that did not have edges. A few men got lost once when I was a girl. The searchers found them standing at the old quarry with their eyes on something down inside the water that should have been too dark to see. They came back home and would not say what they had looked at. They would not look at anything small ever again. They used to keep their eyes on the horizon like sailors." June did not vanish with the others. She had moved to a nursing home the year before. She died a few weeks after the town emptied. The nurse said she opened her eyes at 4 in the morning and said it stopped, and then let her last breath out as if the body were a door that had been held closed too long. A federal team ran a drone over the ridge. The live feed showed rooftops and 2 church steeples and a little football field where the grass had run to patchy brown. The drone drifted toward the far tree line and then lost signal in a circle so well defined you could draw it on a map. The drone fell like a gull hit by a stone and did not make a sound when it landed. When a ranger hiked to the spot, he found the drone lying on needles with one propeller still turning slowly. He felt a tug in his chest that made his eyes water. He picked up the machine and walked backward out of the trees because he did not trust his legs to turn his body around. Investigators built a timeline. People had baked bread, people had filled their trucks, students had scrawled notes and drawn shapes with bored hands. At about 9 at night, phones in town placed calls to numbers that mattered. Those calls connected. On the recordings, you could hear breath and the sound of someone on the other end listening, and then the call ended in a neat click. At a little after 2, the street cameras caught a fog that thickened in pockets and then slid like water being pushed by a hand. The fog pooled at intersections and under the school steps and along the front of the diner. The fog did not behave the way a fog behaves. It stayed where it wanted. It lifted when it wanted. It did not care about wind. At 2:17, every clock that used a battery in town stopped at the same tick. The ones that used the wall power did not. A volunteer named Quinn took notes on everything that felt small and wrong. He wrote that the flag on the pole by the hall did not move, even though the line of pines behind it bowed. He wrote that a crow put its feet on the roof of the post office and sat down like an old man and did not take off for a long time. He wrote that a smell rose from the grass when the fog lifted. It smelled like pennies and also like moss near a spring. He wrote that if he looked at the line of woods too long, he forgot what he had just been doing. When he read his notes later, there were gaps where he had jumped a line and left an empty space and then resumed the sentence. He did not remember lifting his pen. The last person to see the townsfolk as townsfolk might have been the night watchman at the water plant. His name was Hank, and he was a quiet man. His sister told a deputy that he used to hum hymns when he played cards. He called the county line at 11 with a simple report: "You have got some kind of weather over here, but the radar is clean." The line went silent and then picked up again, and Hank said, "I can see them." When the dispatcher asked who, he said everyone. Then he said, "They are not in a line." Then he said, "They are not looking at me." Then he said, "I am going to lock the door." The recording ends with the sound of a latch sliding home. The door stood open when Lila got there the next day. The lock was undamaged. There were 2 sets of keys on a hook by the frame. Both sets were hanging there. I drove in at dusk, a month after the first day. I am not a detective. I write and I listen, and sometimes people answer the phone when I call. I had kept my distance because I thought distance was respectful, and because I thought the thing in the valley did not want to be watched. In the end, the silence pulled me like tide. I left my car on the far side of the bridge and carried a small recorder and a paper notebook. I felt foolish walking into a place I could not explain to myself. Main Street felt wider than it had on the news, the way a sanctuary feels wider when you stand in it alone. I walked past the barbershop, past the bench in front of the hardware store where a half-finished whittling lay on the slats. The diner door was unlocked. I went in and stood by the counter and listened. The air made a low sound that did not come from any machine I could see. It was a tone you feel in your ribs and in the bridge of your nose. The jukebox was off. The clock above the pies had stopped at 2:17 and then had been wound again by some deputy who had not wanted to look at it any longer in that position. I put my recorder on the counter and pressed the red button and told it the time so that I would not betray myself later and pretend that I had not meant to do this. Night came not in a rush, but in layers. The streetlights stuttered and then climbed to brightness. The trees around the town looked like a dark tide ring. I stood on the diner steps and smelled the air and felt the temperature drop. A sound rose from the end of the street. It was not footsteps. It was the sound of many people standing from chairs at the same time. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I stepped back inside even though I had not meant to do that. I steadied myself on the counter. I told myself that I would count to 30 and then step back out like a person with a normal sense of courage. I reached 12 when a shape crossed the window. It was not a person. It was the absence of a person, like a cutout moved along glass. Another shape followed it, another passed in the other direction. I stood with my hand on the counter and counted again. My mouth had gone dry. When I finally walked out, the street was empty. The fog that did not behave like fog had gathered at the corner by the school. It had not come from the river or from the field. It had arrived the way a thought arrives when your guard is down. The chalkboard inside the school was visible through the door window if I stood on the steps. The message was still there in its first form. Do not follow us. I told myself that I would not. I told myself I had not come to cross any line. I do not know who I was trying to convince. At 2 in the morning, the low tone grew stronger. My teeth ached. The power in the streetlights thinned and made a ring around each lamp like a faint halo that pulled away and then settled. I walked to the middle of the street and stood under the light out of an instinct as old as campfires. I looked toward the woods and saw what every person who had ever stepped into this valley must have seen when the hour was right. The line between trees moved like breath. Not wind, breath. The dark changed shade, pale and then deep and then pale again. The fog gathered itself and unspooled a path across the asphalt toward the school steps. It did not slide like smoke. It built itself like a road. There were impressions in it. The impressions were not feet, and yet I knew that feet had made them. I took one step toward it. My heel left the safety of the manhole cover where I had planted myself without thinking. The cover hummed under my boot. I lifted my toe. Something like a pressure against my chest told me to stop. The chalk words were in my mind, clear as a voice. Do not follow us. I said it out loud, not as a spell, not as anything wise, but as a thing to break the hold of the hour. Do not follow us. The fog quivered like a thought that has been interrupted. A sound, like a breath being held, moved across the street. I stepped back, and then back again. The fog did not pursue me. It thinned at the edges, and then pulled again by the steps. I felt no heat and no cold from it. I felt only a pull, like the sea at your knees. I turned and walked away without running because I did not want to know what the running would invite. Down by the river, I sat on the curb with the recorder in my hand. The red light was still on. I clicked stop and felt foolish for the ceremony of it. I drove out while the night was still heavy. On the bridge, the compass in my dash spun a half turn and then steadied the way it had for Lila on that first day. On the highway, the radio in my car went silent and then came back with a preacher talking about a garden and a gate. I turned it off and drove in quiet and watched the pale line of morning approach like the edge of paper being slid over a dark surface. Back at my apartment, I listened to the recording alone with the blinds shut. I heard the first minutes clearly, my shoes on tile, my breath steady, the words I had said to mark the time. Then the tone entered. It rose and fell. It did not sound like a tone from a machine. It sounded like a tone from a throat that had learned something about singing that people do not know. I heard the scrape of my boots as I braced against the counter. I heard the word I said when I stepped outside. I heard my second set of steps slow. Then I heard something I did not do. My voice spoke in a whisper I do not remember making. It said all at once. The words were not a sentence. They were a collection. Names, the water plant, the quarry, the line of trees, the school steps, the pie clock, the tricycle, the breath, the gate. The last word was a breath that had been shaped into a word so gently that a person listening might think they had imagined it. Home. I sent copies to 2 people I trusted. One was a sound engineer for a local station who had more patience than caution. He called to say that the file had a layer under it like a ghost of an old tape. He said the word ghost and then apologized. He said he could remove the layer and let me hear the raw voice. He sent me a cut an hour later. I listened to it and heard nothing at all for 10 seconds, and then heard a shape of air that held its form the way water holds the shape of a jar. I deleted the file. I do not know why I did that. It felt like throwing a glass into a sink to stop it from breaking in your hand. The other person was a ranger named Blake who had been in the diner that first night with the team. He left me a message after midnight. He said that the trail by the quarry had been posted with new signs and a chain. He said he had walked the boundary twice, and it had felt like walking a circle around a sleeping animal. He said that if I came back, we would walk to the line and look out, and then we would turn around and go home. He said it as if speaking the plan made it law. The town of Shaw Ridge stands empty. The diner is locked now. The school door has boards over the window. The chalk message still exists behind the boards. Deputies check it the way families check the face of a sleeping child. The clocks run when someone winds them. When no one winds them, they stop at the same minute again. The county mows the grass on the football field twice a season and leaves the edges by the trees to grow tall. Elliot keeps his radio by the couch and turns it on at dusk and pretends to sleep. He hears the carrier rise and fall. He hears the whisper that might be stay and might be away. He does not answer. He says that is the only rule that matters. People who drive the county roads at night will tell you they see porch lights in the trees where there are no houses. People who fish below the dam will tell you that the surface can look like a floor even when the current is strong. People will tell you they wake at 2:17 and hold their breath for a count and then let it out without knowing why. They do not want answers. They want the hour to pass. Sometimes a car stops on the shoulder by the bridge, and a person gets out and walks to the center of the span and puts a hand on the rail and looks into the dark. They are the kind who cannot leave a story alone. They are me, and they are you. They stand with their hand on metal that has known winter and summer and the weight of trucks. They feel a tremor in the bones of the bridge that might be traffic on a road far away and might be something breathing. They think a thought they will not write down. Then they go home. That is the part of the story that matters more than the rest. You go home, you do not follow, you let Shaw Ridge keep its people wherever they went, and you let the valley keep its hum. The sheriff keeps the legal pad in a drawer. The list of odd things is long. It has coffee that stayed warm too long. It has dogs that hid under trucks. It has a crow that sat like a man. It has a drone that fell without sound. It has a chalkboard with a sentence that acts like a fence. When she locks the drawer at night, she rests her hand on the wood a moment longer than she needs to. She is not a superstitious woman. She is a woman who has learned respect as if it were a craft. When the wind is right, the ridge sends a low tone down the river. It lingers by the bridge and then moves along the water. People hear it and think of a train that is very far away and yet also near. They go about their lives, they set out plates, they fold shirts, they check the locks. They do these things without knowing why each movement feels a little careful. The town remains, nestled in its bowl of trees, held by a shape that is not on any map. The day will come when someone steps across the line because they cannot stand not to. The world is full of brave people and also of foolish ones. I hope they remember the words on the slate. I hope they speak them out loud. I hope the valley lets them go. What happened in Shaw Ridge happened at night while clocks trembled and a fog made a road where no road had been. It carried a whole town into a place with no furniture for our ideas. No bulletins were posted that could ease it. No puzzle could be solved to close it. We are left with a street where plates cooled and a bridge where the compass spins. We are left with a message that feels like a hand placed gently against your chest. Do not follow us. And so we do not. We stand at the bridge and listen to the hum, and then we go home. And on the way, we watch the trees and think they look like a crowd that has decided to keep a promise forever.